Chapter 42. Dan completed. Mo held the fasting pill in front of him, his eyes filled with joy. This was his fourth try and he finally succeeded. The fasting pill was the size of a longan fruit. Its color was an attractive blue-green, with a delicate fragrance being emitted. Just a look made one unable to resist wanting to eat it. Fasting pills were mostly prepared for those cultivators who were in seclusion and who had the money. He didn't immediately start making a second one. The success of this fasting pill meant that his direction was correct. With that in the front, what he needed to think about now was the success rate. There were only 6 portions of ingredients left. At the very least, he needed to make 4 fasting pills. In other words, he could only fail 2 more times. In reality, on the 3rd try, he had almost succeeded. However, he slipped up at a small place and everything failed. His consciousness could help him detect the changes of the herbs inside the cauldron and he could accordingly adjust his Ling energy. Spiritual power was really a good thing. Mo thought blissfully. Other than Dan making, after he swept over the other spells with his consciousness and made adjustments, not only did his consumption of Ling energy go down, the effects also greatly improved. He did have a few fractions of self-awareness. Even though spiritual power was amazing, but his own experience and knowledge was extremely limited. Even with the help of his spiritual power, the changes he could make were limited. But even those minor changes were very effective. He mused that he should go to the records of the sect to take a look and see if he could find any jade sticks about this area. He was an inner sect disciple now. It would be dumb if he didn't seek out some benefits for himself, ending up with a cold-faced master who couldn't be relied upon. It was more realistic to rely on himself. Sword cultivators might prioritize Ling energy and not spiritual power, but Mo believed what Wukong sword sect had accumulated over the years definitely surpassed his aimless fumbles. Of course, that was for the future. Right now, he had many things to work on. Other than Dan making, taking care of the Ling fields was also an important job. Even more, for him who had no money at the moment, earning Jingshi was the question he must consider at the present. It had been a while since those Ling grass and herbs had been planted. Some were nearing the harvest time. How to sell them off was also a headache for him. Before he entered Juji, he didn't want to go outside the gates of the mountain. Suddenly remembering Master had said if he didn't have enough materials, he had to use his own Jingshi to buy. Did that mean that the sect's materials could be brought? Then did that mean he could sell them? Mo walked out of his Dan room. In the yard, a crowd of female disciples worked hard at preparing all kinds of herbs. Scanning around, Mo's gaze landed on a female disciple. He remembered clearly that the first day he arrived, she was the first to greet him. She seemed to be quite authoritative among this group of female disciples. She was dressed in cotton cloth and an apron, no makeup on, sweat beading her forehead. This shimmy, Mo went to greet her. Even though his age was most likely smaller than the other, but due to the rules of the sect, he didn't dare to overstep. She saw Mo and hurriedly stood. Shixiang. I've just gotten here and do not know many of the rules in the yard. Master is focused on making Dan, so I can only trouble shimmy. Mo said warmly. But it was a pity that his face was frozen and it looked slightly frightening. After the initial panic, the female disciples quickly calmed down and said, Shixiang is too polite. What is Shixiang's question? Mo asked her his question. This female disciple brushed away the hair in front of her head and smiled. Shixiang might not know, but all the herbs in this yard belong to the sect. Other than a certain amount that can be withdrawn, all others need people to pay with Jingshi. But the price is 2/10 lower than the market price. Shixiang is a Ling plant farmer. If you have Ling plants and grasses, you can sell them to this yard. The purchase price of normal herbs are about 2/10 lower than the market price, but other than Jingshi, Shixiang will receive contribution points to exchange for scriptures and other things. If it is rare and valuable Ling herbs and grasses, our sect's purchase price is the same as the market. In the future, when Shixiang becomes accomplished at Dan making, the sect can help sell the Dan that Shixiang makes. Our sect's Yen Lushu is skilled at business and usually can sell them for a good price. He only takes 2/10 as a commission. But like before, other than Jingshi, Shixiang can receive contribution points. Finishing, she handed Mo a jade stick. The price of ling grasses and herbs will change each month. Yen Lu Shu will order someone to make it into a jade stick. This is the inventory list of the prices for this month of ling herbs. Zuoremo took it and gave his thanks. Shi Xiang doesn't have to be too polite. Shimi is Su Qing and the first seat of this yard's outer sect disciples. In the future, Shi Xiang, please take care of me. If Shi Xiang has any questions, come find me. You can also find me if you need to purchase any materials. Su Qing said respectfully. Thanks, Shimi. Zuoremo said gratefully. Taking the list, Zuoremo went back to the Dan room and studied the list. He calculated and found the cost of the raw materials for the fasting pill was about 3 pieces of second-grade jingsher, and its price was only half a second-grade jingsher over the cost of the materials. If the success rate was accounted for, there was basically no profit. As expected, it was basically impossible to rely on low-level Dan to make money. It really was just practice. But that was normal. If fasting pills were really that profitable, then countless people would be breaking their heads for a chance to learn how to make Dan. In the following days, Zuoremo continued to make fasting pills. In the process, he had failed once, but as he became more familiar, it took a lot less effort. 10 portions of materials, it made 6 fasting pills. This kind of result could only be called just passable. There was nothing that was worth being proud of. Other than leaving behind the 5 pills, the last one he sold to Su Qing and received 3 pieces of second-grade jingsher. Adding on that he would have an allowance of 20 pieces of second-grade jingsher, he finally wasn't penniless. In the ling fields of West Wind Valley, Zuoremo carefully examined each stalk of ling herbs and grass. In the jade sticks of Elder Wei Nan, there had been detailed introductions of these herbs and the methods of cultivating them that he had found. Like snowy foxtail grass, it was snowy white and soft, named for its foxtail-like shape. Its biggest use was to make a famous kind of paper, snowy fox paper. Snowy fox paper was soft and pure white, extremely well suited for making paper seals. Paper was a kind of widespread material. Other than all kinds of paper cranes, it was an essential ingredient in making seal curses and seal soldiers. But the cultivation of snowy foxtail grass wasn't easy as its growth was slow. Especially for snowy foxtail grass which was above 3rd grade. The price was never low. Only 3rd grade snowy foxtail grass could be used to manufacture 4th grade snowy fox paper. Elder Wei Nan had discovered a method for cultivating snowy foxtail grass. The most effective way was to plant it with butterfly grass. Butterfly grass was an extremely common kind of ling grass. Only the most docile and hardy ling beasts would eat it. Basically, no one would plant it. But if butterfly grass and snowy foxtail grass were planted together, the growth speed of snowy foxtail grass would increase, and the blue-purple butterfly grass would become a rare sky blue. This sky blue butterfly grass was deeply favored by all kinds of ling beasts, especially high-grade ling beasts. The price wasn't low. Many times, Zuoremo couldn't help but be in awe of Elder Wei Nan who he had never met. In Elder Wei Nan's jade sticks, there wasn't any profound scriptures, but useful techniques like this one were countless. Like the method of growing butterfly grass and snowy foxtail grass together, he felt that even the most experienced and powerful ling plant farmers wouldn't have thought of it. Maybe it was because Elder Wei Nan didn't have very high cultivation, so he would spend so much effort studying those things. Every day, Zuoremo would cast the spells of a ling plant farmer on the plants in the ling fields. The amount of work was much greater than he had imagined, but he had endured. Over time, he had gotten used to it. He kept on cultivating embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation each day in the rock room. In the past, he hadn't known the many uses of spiritual energy and had more or less been inattentive. Now that he had seen the effects, he was much more focused. In a reversal of the past, he actually was not in a hurry to enter Zhuji anymore. His spiritual power was much stronger than before, but there was a lot of room for him to improve. With the help of the Ling vein, the progress of the Ling energy in his body was faster than his estimations. Zhuji wasn't far away. He had a premonition. Dongfu Hall. Dongfu Hall was the residence of the master of Dongfu. It had been constructed for Dongfu Xianren and had been used since then. It took up the biggest secret paradise in Dongfu, and it was Dongfu's one true secret paradise. The so-called secret paradises that were sold on the market were only places with slightly more abundant Ling energy and couldn't be really considered a secret paradise. Yu Bai slowly woke up from his meditation, satisfaction gleaming in his warm eyes. The density of Ling energy in Dongfu Hall was multiple times what it was outside. The fact that he could become the leader of the younger generation of Dongfu was in large part due to this point. The effects of his daily meditation was 2 or 3 times what other people had. After accumulating over the years, this kind of advantage would increasingly become greater. Master. Seeing Master, he hurriedly stood. How have you been feeling recently? Tian Song Zi asked as he smiled harmoniously. Tian Song Zi was wearing the robes of a Taoist, a knot on his head, extremely carefree. Relatively stable, but still far from becoming Jindan. No hurry, no hurry. Tian Song Zi waved his hand. You are still young, don't rush. Becoming Jindan is a process. Did you hear the news about the sword test conference? Yu Bai paused. Does Master want this disciple to attend the sword test conference? Even though he had a shining reputation in Dongfu, but he really didn't much confidence in attending the sword test conference, which was a large-scale completion for the entire Kun Luanjing. And from what he had seen, Master never really cared about worldly rewards, so why would he suddenly become interested in the sword test conference? Tian Song Zi smiled, answering, wait for me to finish. The internal happenings of the sword test conference are layered, but we don't have to touch that dirty water. His expression became severe, his gaze worried, and said solemnly, I received news that 2/3 of Bloody Sky Metropolis has already landed in the hands of Yao Ma. Yu Bai paled in shock. How could that be so? Yao Ma are starting to recover their strength. Tian Song Zi sighed. 3,000 years have passed. Yao Ma recuperated and have adapted. Would they be satisfied being suppressed? Yu Bai's expression was incomparably bad. He knew what this meant. The situation in the future is hard to predict. My Dongfu needs to prepare early. Tian Song Zi said heavily, I will host a Dongfu sword test conference in hopes of finding some potential talents. When the nest is being attacked, will there be unharmed eggs? I will tell the other sections. Right now, it has to be a united front in order to fight for a chance at survival. Yu Bai was silent. A beat later, he said, I'm afraid Master will put in the effort but not be thanked. Do within the limits, and depend on the heavens. Tian Song Zi sighed and waved his hand. Go and create a list of youths that should be taken note of. Yes. Yu Bai bowed and retreated with a worried expression. Chapter 43 First Grade Lingdan. His cold-faced master seemed to have no intentions of wanting to come out of her Dan room. With Jingshi on his hands, Zuo decided to start working on his Dan-making skills. At the very least, for basic Dan like fasting pills, he shouldn't have problems such as the efficiency rate. Buying the materials from Su Qing Shimi, Zuo started to furiously practice making fasting pills. His income and costs basically was even. The biggest question Zuo faced was how to avoid failure. Failing once meant losing 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. His level of familiarity had greatly increased. The time needed for the process shortened from the previous 10 hours to 6 hours, but the cost was also enormous. His 20-something pieces of second-grade Jingshi had been completely squandered. It was all caused by the failures. But thinking about the future, he could only grit his teeth and bear it. This was the last portion of ingredients for the today. If he could successfully make it, he could just manage to return to Su Qing Shimi the 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi that he owed her. These days, as he had become familiar with Su Qing Shimi, he could leave a tab as he brought materials daily. Zuo didn't want to owe any debts. After making this fasting pill, he wanted to rest for a time and wait for the Ling herbs in the Ling fields to mature. Even though there was only a single portion, he wasn't nervous. After the repeated high-intensity practice of the past days, he was now extremely familiar with the process of making fasting pills. He didn't know if it was caused by the spiritual power, but his head seemed to be functioning better. He hadn't been weak before, but it had felt like he was in the clouds and mists. Now, he seemed to have left behind those clouds. Did cultivating embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation make someone smarter? This idea was too nonsensical. Even Zhuo felt it was extremely absurd and threw it to one side. Just like normal, Zhuo threw the different herbs into the cauldron and put his hands on the 8 trigrams plate to start. The consciousness was especially sensitive to changes in Ling energy. He occasionally was able to even feel the Ling energy changes in the herbs inside the cauldron. Some became excited, some flashed and disappeared, some slowly became weaker. Even though he was very familiar with the fasting pill, but the kinds of Ling energy transformations and vibrations between the herbs still attracted his attention. Unconsciously, his consciousness became muddled. It was like the hands that were controlling the 8 trigrams plate suddenly were possessed and abruptly changed their position. A thin string of gold light dropped from the sky and landed in his hands, then was deflected into the cauldron. After a while, he slowly became clear-headed again. When he saw the gold string, he stared in shock. How did he end up casting Art of Crimson Flame? He shook. Damn it. Don't ruin the Dan. He still owed Su Qing Shimi 3 pieces of 2nd-grade jingsher. If this Dan was ruined, then he really had outstanding debts. His consciousness penetrated through the cauldron. A reaction had not occurred inside. Zhuo's heart jumped and he hurriedly opened the cauldron. A green Dan was lying silently on the bottom. Zhuo released a breath. It looked as though that it hadn't been ruined. He raised the fasting pill and prepared to put it in the pouch when he saw a glitter of gold light from the corner of his eye. He first blanked, and then rushed to hold this fasting pill on his hand in front of his eyes for a closer examination. Only upon close examination did he find that this fasting pill was different than the fasting pills he had made previously. The color was deep green, not the blue-green. If he looked even more closely, he found that there were extremely thin gold patterns mixed inside. That was the cause of that gold light that Zhuo had detected just now. Also, the weight of it was slightly heavier than normal fasting pills. Was this still a fasting pill? Zhuo wasn't so sure. Eating it to try it out, Zhuo didn't dare. But he didn't bear to throw it away. Selling it to Su Qing Shimi, he was afraid of conning someone else. He knew that the transformation definitely was caused by the Art of Crimson Flame that he unconsciously cast when his thoughts had been wandering. Theoretically, Art of Crimson Flame was used to gather the essence of the sun. Its base attribute should lean towards fire and logically, the Dan shouldn't be harmful. Pondering for a while, he still decided to keep this Dan. After Master came out of the Dan room, he would then ask her. Master had entered the Dan room over 10 days ago, yet the door to the room was still tightly shut. Sometimes, Zhuo couldn't help but think, was all skilled Dan cultivators like this? He had finished his quota a long time ago, but Master didn't show any signs of coming out of the Dan room. Zhuo decided to work on his own cultivation. Under the present circumstances, he had reached his limits with the 5 spells of a Ling plant farmer. To progress, he needed to have jade scrolls about future stages. Other than practicing finger motions to avoid becoming out of practice, he spent the rest of his time on embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation and refining his sword essence. He didn't know if refining was the word commonly used, but he felt that it was very descriptive. Right now, his sword essence had only formed. It was like a sword embryo that needed continuous hammering and grinding before it could become a true sword. Xan Yen Shirshu's sword essence was deeply engraved in his head. Under that sky-shattering sword essence, he had died countless times. What he needed to do was to try to mimic Shirshu's sword essence. If he couldn't get the aura, at the least, he had to form the appearance. Then he could frighten people with it. He was resolute that unless it was necessary, he wouldn't show it. Even Yu Bai could clearly see his origins. If it landed in the eyes of Master and the Shirshu, it would be strange if they weren't suspicious. Xan Yen Shirshu had never taught him. If they pressed, Pu Yao's existence most likely couldn't be hidden. Whenever he thought about Yin Zan Shirshu's icy gaze, Zhuo felt shivers go up his spine. No matter the sect, stealing was a great crime. Zhuo was very regretful now about having fought in Dongfu. Who would have thought that Yu Bai's eyes were so keen that he could see the origins of his sword essence? But regret was useless now. In any case, it was dealing with it as it came The barefoot wasn't afraid of those wearing shoes. He actually put even more effort in practicing now. He couldn't use a flying sword. As a result, he could only work with Art of Aged Gold. He faithfully followed the basic sword scriptures that Wei Xingxixiang had left behind in the jade sticks. He hadn't felt it before, but after comprehending sword essence, Zhou Emo found that while these basic scriptures might be simple, but every one of them was important. So he turned back and started to practice these most basic scriptures. Before this, Zhou Emo had never cultivated the sword and really could be considered a blank page in this area. After being sliced countless times by Pu Yao using Xen Yen Shirshu's sword essence, he finally comprehended something. But his fundamentals were really lacking, and so even with his comprehension, it was not rooted. If he didn't steady it, the comprehension would quickly be worn away. Because of it, he was now turning back to cultivate the most basic of the basic sword scriptures. These basic scriptures were all gathered from Wei Sheng's experience of countless battles. They were practical and effective. Zhou Emo, who had a slight comprehension of sword essence, could look from a higher viewpoint to judge these basic scriptures, and he learnt extremely quickly. These basic sword scriptures managed to help fill the gaps of Zhou Emo's fundamentals. In the Little West Wind Yard, Zhou Emo solitarily practiced those basic sword scriptures. The sword scriptures were very simple. It could be learned on the first try. But it was like Zhou Emo was enchanted as he patiently practiced over and over. Before meeting Pu Yao, before meeting Wei Xingxixiang, the spell he was most skilled with, Little Art of Cloud and Rain, had been refined like this. He never hoped for any kind of enlightenment. In his mind, nothing was more practical than working at something bit by bit. Behind the most beautiful and exquisite things was the most dullness and loneliness. He was very skilled with embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, and his Ling energy was steadily increasing. In comparison, his spiritual power progressed much faster. He was like a cultivator in seclusion. Each day was scheduled to the fullest, and no time was wasted. What was worth celebrating was that the damned crazy woman hadn't bothered him recently. Time passed like this. A sword energy fly out of the sky. Zhou Emo, who had been practicing sword scriptures in the yard, stopped. Master had come out. Jumping onto the roof, climbing onto the back of the gray-beaked goose, the gray-beaked goose gave a clear call and flew up with spread wings. It carried Zhou Emo towards the fragrant ginger yard. Fragrant ginger yard. There was tiredness on Shifeng Rong's face. The dan-making process had been more than a month, and it had taken a heavy toll on her. When Zhou Emo arrived, Su Qing was reporting to her what had happened in the yard during the time. Seeing Zhou Emo come over, Shifeng Rong's face became cold. Have you made 5 fasting pills? Completed. Zhou Emo presented the 5 fasting pills he had prepared beforehand with a lowered head. Shifeng Rong's expression eased slightly and indicated for Su Qing to take it. Nodding her head, she said, "Not bad, it seemed that you hadn't been lazy. You've just started dan making, so if you have any questions, you can ask them now." At the side, Su Qing gave an admiring expression. She might be the first seat of Fragrant Ginger Yard's outer sect disciples, and was very trusted by Shifeng Rong, but she could only learn, but didn't have the right to ask questions. However, she quickly refocused. She hadn't been thrown out, that meant she was allowed to listen. This was a rare opportunity. Hearing this, Zhou Emo was overjoyed and asked several questions he had been puzzled by. Shifeng Rong answered them one by one. Zhou Emo suddenly thought about the dan that he had used, Art of Crimson Flame, to make and rushed to take it out. "Master, this is a dan that I accidentally made. It seems to be different from the fasting pill. This disciple doesn't know what it is. Master, please take a look." Shifeng Rong took the dan and couldn't help but make a sound as she carefully examined it. After a while, she asked, "Tell how you made it." Zhou Emo narrated the entire process in detail. When he mentioned that he had accidentally cast Art of Crimson Flame, Shifeng Rong seemed to have understood something. When Zhou Emo finished, Shifeng Rong said, "This fasting pill has essence of the sun added in. The effects are extremely young and can enter the ranks of first-grade dan. After consumption, it can make one stimulated and arouse Ling energy. But the side effects afterward would most likely not be minor. I have never seen this kind of dan before. You can name it and find your yen le shu to sell it and earn some jingshi. Zuemo asked dumbly, how much could it sell for? Feng Rong's face turned cold. Go ask yourself. Finishing, she started to ignore Zuemo. Zuemo didn't know where he had offended his cold-faced master and could only leave. However, he quickly became happy again. He had accidentally managed to make a Ling Dan. Fasting pills could only be considered a kind of medicine dan and couldn't be really called a Ling Dan, much less enter a grade. Zuemo was very clear that any Ling Dan that could enter the grade, its price wouldn't be low. For Zuemo, who was in desperate need of jingshi, what would make him even happier than finding a way to earn jingshi? Countless jingshi were waving their hands at him. He mused inside, he need to find a time to go see Yen le Shu. Chapter 44. A tragedy caused by one piece of jingshi. Zuemo named this Lingdan Great Strength Pill. It sounded extremely crass, but he didn't care. He had planned on making a few more to give to Yen le Shu to sell for jingshi, but very quickly, he could only put this matter to the side. In the Ling fields, a batch of Ling grasses and herbs were ready for harvest. He had farmed attentively each day. Like Little Art of Cloud and Rain, Art of Earth Energy, and Art of Crimson Flame, he would cast it multiple times each day. And Art of Flora, and Art of Aged Gold, would be used once every couple of days. Zuemo had never farmed like this in the past. Due to his diligent care, the growth of the plants in West Wind Valley was extremely outstanding. Some of the Ling plants with short growth periods were ready for harvest. For Zuemo, whose purse was rusted, this was really a perfectly timed rainstorm. Due to its importance, he even asked for a break from Master. Inside West Wind Valley, a skeleton bent over the Ling fields and sweated. Finally all done. Zuemo sat on the ground as he panted. Looking at the small pile of Ling plants in front of him, he was filled with satisfaction. Then he turned to look in the corner. The third-grade fire dragon grass was almost full-grown. A bright fiery red, very beautiful. He sorted out the Ling grasses and herbs by type and then by grade. Then he carefully wrapped them. After all that, Zuemo rode the gray-beaked goose towards Yen le Shu's residence. When Yen le saw Zuemo, especially the big bag on Zuemo's back, his eyes instantly lit up. Did Shi grow something good? Putting down the large bag, Zuemo wiped the sweat on his forehead. This is a bunch of Ling herbs that were just grown. Shirbua, please help me sell them. Letting someone else sell them required giving 2/10 to the sect, but Zuemo still decided to let the sect sell them. Other than the fact that Yen le Shirbua knew more about the market than he did, the sect's contribution points were very useful. And the more one contributed to the sect, their status within the sect would naturally become higher. Even though Pu Yao was in his sea of consciousness, but this fickle and perverse Ren Yao could not be relied on. Pu Yao was a completely dangerous factor. If he didn't have to touch him, it was best not to. In comparison, Zuemo was much more willing to take advantage of the sect's power. At the very least, the elders of the sect appeared to be normal people. But this way, raising his own status in the sect had become very important. Cultivation, the higher it went, the more resources it needed. Trying to rely on an individual's power, it was far less realistic than using the power of the sect. Even roaming cultivators had their own little circles. Cultivators who truly secluded themselves were the rarest of the rare. Yen le crouched down and flipped through the Ling grasses Zuemo had brought, the joy on his face becoming heavier. Lots of good stuff. Third-grade South Wolfberry, third-grade 7-leaf chrysanthemum, whoa, and there's also daystar grass, also third grade. This can be sold for a pretty good price. Yen le seemed to be very familiar and recognized all of the Ling grasses and grains. Zuemo was in awe and hurriedly flattered. Shirbua is really great. You recognize all of these? Feng Rong was the smallest of the four, so Zuemo's address of Yen le turned from Shu to Shirbua. In business, you have to recognize those. Yen le felt very good about Zuemo's flattery. His originally small eyes became a line and he said amiably, as expected of a Ling plant farmer, to grow something not just faster than others, but better than others. Shiji has put thought in. All you planted are things easy to sell and at a good price. He didn't know if it was that he felt guilt, but Zhuo felt that Yan Li's gaze seemed full of meaning. Did Shibua also know about Elder Wei Nan? He forced himself to remain calm. Shibua should also know just how poor this disciple is. If I don't plant something to sell, I won't even have the Jingshi for learning about Dan making. He was very grateful for his zombie face. It really was the best disguise. Yan nodded. Without Jingshi, you can't learn anything. You are a Ling plant farmer now, don't worry about Jingshi. As long as you keep farming, us elders wouldn't treat you unfairly. Of course. Zhuo smiled in agreement, but his expressionless face truly gave others a strange feeling. Yan randomly picked 2 plants out, South Wolfberry and this gold grain red tulip. Don't sell it, you keep it. In the future, you'll use it in Dan making. I remember your master had especially asked me to help gather it for her. These 2 are easily sold, but it's hard to buy. Zhuo hurriedly put away those 2 ling herbs. Everything else I'll go help you sell. What the sect needs, I will give to you according to the market price. Finishing, he took out a piece of Jingshi to hand to Zhuo. This is a piece of 3rd-grade Jingshi. It's a down payment. Take it. I'll get your Li Yingfeng Shiji to send over the remainder in a few days. Zhuo stared dazedly at the 3rd-grade Jingshi on Yan Li's hand. 3rd-grade Jingshi. This was the first piece of 3rd-grade Jingshi that he had ever seen. Seeing Zhuo's dumb gaze, Yan Li couldn't help but start to laugh. He threw the Jingshi at Zhuo. Arlight, outside, don't embarrass me like this. Zhuo's brain still hadn't managed to fully recover. Previously, he had thought that this harvest would be of some value, but he had never thought that just the down payment was a piece of 3rd-grade Jingshi. The wealth that dropped down from the sky pounded Zhuo into dizziness. He felt that his entire body was floating. He suddenly remembered another matter. Zhuo, who had been walking away, turned back and took out great strength pill. Shibua, can you see how much this Lingdan is worth? Yan Li took the Lingdan and narrowed his eyes for an examination. You made it? What's its use? Zhuo narrated what Master had said. Then I'll try to help you sell it. Everyone takes some time to accept new Lingdan. I cannot guarantee how much I can sell this for. Yan Li said after thinking. Zhuo naturally was very grateful. His purse being the fullest it had ever been, he completely forgot that he had thought of using great strength pill to earn Jingshi. Even as he returned to the little West Wind yard, he was still muddle-headed. Like a miser, he looked at this 3rd-grade Jingshi. The color and intactness of a 3rd-grade Jingshi far surpassed a 2nd-grade Jingshi. All the edges were regular and complete, the entire body transparent and glowing without any signs of impurity. It was like a clear crystal. But the Ling energy inside was extremely powerful. He gently caressed the Jingshi, a drunken expression in his eyes. Suddenly, his hands seemed to have been cut by something, and the Jingshi in his hands lit up unexpectedly. Zhuo stood, paralyzed as he looked at the glowing Jingshi. A strong pounding feeling rose in his heart as though something was going to erupt. The glow from the Jingshi gradually faded, but the pounding in Zhuo's heart became even stronger. What was going on? He was slightly panicked. Idiot, you are entering Zhuji? Pu Yao suddenly appeared with a mocking smile as he looked at Zhuo. Zhuji? Zhuo couldn't attend to the disdain in Pu Yao's voice and hurriedly asked, What's going on? Why am I suddenly going into Zhuji? Pu Yao shrugged his shoulders. When there is enough Ling energy, naturally it is time for Zhuji. You just had been stimulated by the Ling energy in the Jingshi, so the Ling energy inside your body, woke up. Woke up? What am I supposed to do? Zhuo didn't know what to do. Damn it. He hadn't thought he would get to Zhuji so soon. He hadn't even made any preparations. He didn't know what was going to happen next, or what he needed to do. He had always felt that Zhuji was far from him. Right, he could go ask the Shibua. Zhuo hit his head and prepared to run towards the gray-beaked goose. Under the shadow of the hair in front of Pu Yao's face, a blade-like curve silently appeared. Don't you want power? I have a method for Zhuji, pretty good, guarantee you will successfully Zhuji and your cultivation will increase greatly. Pu Yao's cool voice was filled with intense enticement. Zhuo's footsteps stopped. What do you want? Zhuo asked between his teeth. Hee. Pu Yao pointed to Zuomo's hands with the third-grade jincture. As expected, this Ren Yao didn't have good intentions. So he was aiming for his third-grade jincture. Zuomo was enraged and snorted, "I should ask Sherbois, he, Zhuji, it's the first gate for a cultivator. But many people don't know that it's also one of the most important gates. It would directly influence your future cultivation. Don't blame me for not warning you. Using those Zhuji Dan won't be of any benefit to you." Pu Yao said leisurely. The pounding in his heart became even stronger. Zuomo felt as though his heart was going to jump out of his chest. Pu Yao's words landed in his ear but became hazy and intangible. Those Sherbois of yours. It's not that I'm underestimating them, but they can't give you much power. Look at your master. She's just not the opponent of the person that changed your features and erased your mind. How about it? I've never cheated you. Embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation is useful, right? Sword essence. Oh, you've reached the threshold. Me, I'm very trustworthy. Pu Yao smiled gently, peerlessly beautiful. One piece of third-grade jincture, this is really cheap. Just a piece of third-grade jincture. If you put some effort in it, you'll earn it again. But the benefits you'll receive would be endless. Is there a business more profitable than this one in this world? The pounding inside his heart became even stronger. Everything in his vision seemed to become twisted. Zuomo felt that something inside his body seemed to have been lit up. Thirsty. He licked his lips and swallowed the saliva. He had a feeling that going to find Master now, there wouldn't be enough time. Here. Zuomo gritted his teeth and threw the third-grade jincture hard at Pu Yao. He wanted to smash this Ren Yao. The smart choice. Pu Yao easily caught the jincture, his thin lips opening. Take that fire dragon grass to Cold Mist Valley. Fire dragon grass. Zuomo's eyes widened as he forced the words through his teeth. This guy. Zuomo wanted to cry. The kind of terrifying thing that was fire dragon grass. Only terrifying people like Shixiang could tolerate it. People like him, there was only one outcome, that was Ling energy collapsing and death. Pu Yao's right eye curved into a crescent and reminded Zuomo, there's not much time left. The feeling of burning inside his body became even stronger. Zuomo wanted to rip off the clothing. The blood vessels were like burning metal pipes. He was abnormally thirsty, abnormally uncomfortable. There wasn't much time left. Unable to care about that much, he took out the spirit traveling seal and pasted it onto his legs. All the Ling energy in his body moving, he grabbed the fire dragon grass and ran towards Cold Misty Valley like a ball of red clouds. He shouted inside. Pu! You cursed Ren Yao! Chapter 45 Struggle Cold Mist Valley, beside the icy pond. Zuomo looked horrific, his entire body looked like a cooked shrimp, red to the point of dripping blood. Bloody veins filled his eyes, which were extremely shocking. In the yard, his body had been like a ball of fire. Right now, he felt his entire body was firewood that had been completely dried and then lit up, and was cracking as it burned. He looked around, slightly dazed. Everything in his vision seemed to have been twisted by the high temperature. His awareness was muddled. He seemed to be struggling in a sea of fire, the relentless waves of fire suffocating him. At any moment, it seemed he would turn into dust. Eat the fire dragon grass. A faraway voice floated into Zuomo's ears. Instinctively, Zuomo shoved the fire dragon grass in his hand into his mouth. A wave of heat traveled through his mouth into his throat. Boom! It was like throwing a pot of hot oil onto fire. In a daze, Zuomo felt the sea of fire seem to have collapsed, and countless fine and scorching flames spread through his organs. The rush of heat was like liquid metal bouncing around in Zuomo's meridians. Zuomo couldn't stop himself from screaming. A hot stream rushed into his head. His fragile head seemed to have been branded with hot metal. A flame suddenly ran onto his clothing. The fire quickly spread. In the blink of an eye, all the clothing on his body turned to flames. What was strange was the fire didn't wound Zuomo at all. Zuomo was naked in the air, his entire body red like a metal skeleton that just came out of the forge. It was possible to see with the naked eye the waves of hot air that were surrounding his body. The howls were deep and rough, like those of a beast. All the blood vessels in Zhuomo's body were enlarged, like metal threads that were being burnt as they encompassed his entire body. So pleasing to the ears. Looking on from the side, Pu Yao's face was intoxicated as he sighed. Even the soul is in pain. It's been so long since I've heard such an enchanting sound, I really missed it. Ah! Zhuo completely lost his mind. He was like a wild beast whose entire body was burning, and howled instinctively. The fire didn't seem content rushing inside his body and burrowed out of his skin, shrouding his body. He became a ball of fire. If Zhuo was clear-headed at this moment, he would be shocked to find the fire that was burning his body was deep red and alluring, extremely similar to the fire in his sea of consciousness. Looking at the deep red flames that were furiously dancing on Zhuomo's body, Pu Yao's gaze instantly darkened. The corner of his mouth, however, swept up. It was unknown what he had been reminded of. The sound of Zhuomo's howls became even deeper, even rougher. The flames surrounding him seemed to burn even more ferociously. Pu Yao's expression changed. After a while, his gaze returned to normal and he said to himself, "The person you chose, I'll give him one chance." Finishing, he pointed a finger at Zhuo. Zhuo seemed to have been struck by a large hammer and was sent flying, landing with a splash in the cold pond. Zhuo was like a stone, quickly sinking. Strangely, the deep red flames around his body were not affected in the slightest by the water, and were still furiously waving. Just at this time, the ice river in Zhuomo's sea of consciousness suddenly started to grind. The icicles crowding in the ice river were pushed by an invisible force and slowly started to flow. The silent and straight ice river, in the blink of an eye, transformed into a river where countless big and small sword energies were moving. Hiss hiss hiss. These sword energies followed the surface of the river as they headed for the flames surrounding the river. As the icy sword essences touched the dancing flames beside the shores, the unexpected happened. The fire grew dramatically. In the sea of consciousness, the fire reached the sky. Even the star in the void overhead was almost consumed by the fire. Only the gravestone in the sea of consciousness was still shrouded in the black clouds, not affected in the slightest. Inside the ice river, the icicles rose up and down even fiercer, the sword essences continuously shooting out with white mist towards the sea of fire. An astounding change was also appearing on Zhuomo's body. A thin layer of ice had appeared on his entirely flushed body. Yet in the blink of an eye, this thin layer would melt and disappear. But after a while, the layer of ice would appear again and repeat. The cold pond wasn't deep. Zhuo quickly reached the bottom of the pond. The temperature at the bottom of the pond was multiple times colder than the water at the top, no fish or shrimp to be found. As though it was affected, each time the thin ice appeared, the time it stayed became longer. However, the fires around Zhuomo's body wasn't weakened at all, they were still burning weirdly in the water. A faint light suddenly appeared in Zhuomo's chest. This light traveled through Zhuomo's channels. Every place it passed through, the flame would become smaller, but then very quickly, the red flames would once again continue their dancing. Zhuo seemed to have entered a very strange place. He had completely lost control of his body. Hazily, he felt that he was being burned in a furnace, and then suddenly thrown into the polar regions, but no matter the torment, he didn't have any room to struggle. "Don't forget, even in death, you must not forget," the voice appeared again. A basin of cold water seemed to have been poured over Zhuomo's head. His consciousness recovered clarity for a short moment. Upon clarity, the extreme pain of burning and the bone-aching cold flooded him like the tide. He couldn't help opening his mouth. The icy pond water instantly poured into his mouth. There was nothing that could describe his feelings at this moment. His entire body was furiously burning. The extreme pain from his flesh and bones burning bit by bit almost made him faint. The pond water that had poured in almost froze him to an ice cube. His clear mind instantly became dizzy again. Was this Shuji? Was this the power of the fire dragon grass? That dream. In a daze, Zhuomo's relaxed hands suddenly turned into fists. His entire body bowed, all the strength in the body gathering at this moment. His eyes widened furiously, bright red. Who wanted to control me? Who changed my face and erased my mind? Who did it? Who did it? From the depths of his mind, countless thoughts uncontrollably streamed through. From the depths of his body came a pain of his flesh burning and the bone-breaking coldness. Inside his angry eyes, the flames were swallowed by a bloody red tide. Who did it? Who did it? Who did it? Bastard! The blood in his chest roared. The anger and grief that came from the deepest part of his heart erupted like a volcano. In an instant, it swallowed the fire and the ice. Zuemo seemed to be cursed. He gathered all the energy in his body and threw out his fist. Accompanied by the deep red alluring flames, his fist heavily smashed onto the rock side of the pond. Boom! With Zuemo's fist as the center, a spiderweb of cracks appeared on the rock face. Scorch marks spread out from the center of the impact. Boom! Another punch. Stone fragments flew into the water. A few of them brushed past Zuemo's body, creating a few marks. The fresh blood flowed out, quickly dissolving in the water. Boom boom boom. Zuemo was completely stuck in a trance. His eyes bright red, the tendons tight, he furiously threw out punches. The silent bottom of the pond turned into a muddy mess. Beside the pond, Pu Yao detected the vibrations of the ground. Looking at the whirlpool that appeared in the body, his expression was normal as he raised a hand and caught a water droplet that flew out from the waterfall. Opening his hand, the water drop floated above his bond, round and clear as it reflected his blood eye. You're still not giving a hand? Do you still stupidly believe he could suppress the fire of the Sky Yao? A faint mocking smile appeared on his face as he slowly stated, "You are always like this, never listening to me. 3,000 years have passed yet you are still so stubborn. Do you not know that your choices are forever this idiotic?" He gently blew and the perfect water droplet floating in his hand turned to a gust of mist and dissipated into the air. "Your actions, I was sick of them long ago." Pu Yao patted his hand, his expression indifferent. The vibrations under his feet stopped. The pond recovered its quiet. "It's done." Pu Yao's sharp lips rose and he shrugged. "Ha, this only proved once again your idiotic choices." He just turned his head when he stopped in his steps. Wukong Mountain, Xian Yen, who had been in meditation, suddenly opened his eyes. He jumped up, his body disappearing. In the blink of an eye, he appeared at the peak. A few seconds later, Pei Yuan ran, Yen Lu and Shi Feng Rong also flew over and appeared beside him. The four exchanged looks and with shocked faces, they raised their heads to look at the sky. Dong Fu, Tiansong Zi was browsing the list that Yu Bai had written. "This Zhong Ming Yen is Zuomei Tian's disciple." Tiansong Zi nodded as he remarked, "In Dong Fu, if we're talking about strength, it's between Zuomei Tian and Xian Yen." Zuomei Tian had been very fierce in the past, a person everyone was afraid of. This point was very similar to Xian Yen. But I wonder what his disciple is like. Yu Bai said respectfully, "This disciple had met that Zhong Ming Yen once. Even though we didn't fight, but this disciple gathers from his composure that he most likely isn't weak." "Ha, there's isn't many yous that you call not weak. I heard that Zuomei Tian had put in a lot of blood on this disciple. It's natural he wouldn't be weak." Tian Songzi chuckled. "In the future, Dong Fu is probably yours, Zhong Ming Yen and Wukong Sword Sect's Wei Xing's world. This disciple will not disappoint Master's hopes." Yu Bai responded respectfully. Tian Songzi waved his hands. "Don't care too much about things like reputation. I only hope you can protect yourself in troubled times. This estate, I might not bear to part with it, but your safety is even more important." Yu Bai was moved and responded, "Yes." Seeing Yu Bai's face was full of worry, Tian Songzi couldn't help but comfort. "This master is only planning ahead. Don't worry too much. If something really happens, us old people will be at the front." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a name on the list and was slightly shocked. When was there a Zuemo out of Wukong Sword Sect? How is he special? The first time this disciple heard this name, he had been in a conflict with Zhong Ming Yen and another Dongqi disciples. Because he is a Ling plant farmer, this disciple had been planning on resolving it. I did not expect that he managed to comprehend sword essence. Yu Bai added another sentence. "He has not entered Juji." "Oh." Tian Song Zi's expression changed. Another dangerous character in Wukong sword sect. Comprehending sword essence before entering Zhuji. This kind of sword talent, it's very rare. The heavens really have blessed Wukong sword sect. Between his words, he was slightly envious. Just at this time, his expression suddenly changed and flew out the window. Yu Bai paused before hurriedly following. He only saw Tian Song Zi staring in a daze at the sky above. At the same time, on the highest plum peak of Dong Chi sword sect, a long-haired black-robed man stood against the wind. With a shocked face, he raised his head to look at the sky. Chapter 46 Zhuji, the peak of daytime. The sky was blue and clear, yet what raised people's hairs was that the blue sky was filled with blazing stars. Stars in daytime, Pei Yuan Ran muttered to himself. The other three's expressions all changed. Xixiang. Shi Feng Rong's voice was slightly trembling. What is happening here? I don't know. Pei Yuan Ran's expression was heavy as he shook his head. The apparition of stars appearing in daytime, it happens once every few thousand years. I've only seen it in some records. But it doesn't seem to be a good omen. Even though the four were all Jindan, looking at the strange scene in front of them, their hearts couldn't help but feel cold. In Dongfu, Yu Bai stared with wide eyes at the stars dotting the sky and that proud sun hanging high up in the sky. Fear rose up from the deepest part of his heart and spread through his body. Tian Song Zi muttered, "Stars in daytime, the plum peak of Dong Chi." Light erupted from Zhuamei Tian's eyes as he murmured, "Stars in daytime, in the entire sky Moon Jie." Countless strong people were all alarmed. Looking up at the sky over the 13 primary towns of Sky Moonjia, it was completely filled with cultivators. In the wilderness, on the mountaintops, no matter what the Xiozhou were doing, they all stopped their hands and floated in midair. All of the cultivators' gazes, they were completely focuses on this sky that they were so familiar with. No matter their cultivation, shock was on everyone's face. In Cold Mist Valley, Pu Yao's pupils shrunk. He gazed at the pond before him. In his blood-red vision, he could clearly see a pillar of light that glittered as it came down from the sky and entered the pond. If one used a normal vision, where could they even see a pillar? No Ling energy, no vibrations. Only through his blood eye could this intangible pillar of light be seen. "Do you think you had wagered correctly?" Pu Yao said coldly, murderous intent in his right blood eye. When the sound landed, the clear pond suddenly became as dark as ink. The sound of the waterfall disappeared without a trace. The waterfall was like a broken mustang, docilely flowing into the pond without a splash. The valley fell into a strange silence. Looking at the black water pond, Pu Yao wasn't afraid. He took a strong stride forward, pressing. "For this trash, you decide to fight me?" The black water pond was silent and motionless as though it was dead. A Yao, a pond. They confronted each other like this. Time slipped away. Pu Yao suddenly took back the leg he had stepped with, his expression returning to normal. A kind of disdain was at the corner of his mouth. "Stars in daylight? Hey, do you really think this is still 3,000 years ago? You made it too big." He was somewhat rejoicing at the calamity. The black water pond wasn't affected. Pu Yao shrugged. "So what if it's stars in daylight? Can it extinguish Sky Yao fire? The Sky Yao fire even you can't extinguish?" The black water pond suddenly started to flip as though it was boiling. Explosive sounds came out of the inky black water. Pu Yao raised his head to look at the sky and lightly said a sentence that instantly made the pond water quiet. "Oh, it seems everyone wants to see." In the blink of an eye, the pond regained its clarity. The obedient waterfall resumed its ferocity and roared, the water splashing. Pu Yao gave a light laugh and disappeared. An extremely strong consciousness scanned over Cold Mist Valley. When Zuemo opened his eyes, he instantly shuddered. So cold. The coldness of the water told him where he was situated. The cold pond of Cold Mist Valley. Last time, it had been here where he had broken through to one breath. He was very familiar with this situation. But after he had achieved one breath, he had never felt suffocated in the water. In the past, Zuemo had actually been suspicious that he might turn into a fish. Zuemo bared his teeth. So painful. Any movement and a heart-wrenching pain would come from all over his body. His features instantly twisted. Thankfully, he wasn't dead. What he could remember up until was when that hazy voice told him to eat the fire dragon grass. What happened after, he didn't know at all. But right now, he wasn't willing to think, too lazy to move. His entire body was hurting, and very quickly, he found he wasn't wearing a scrap of clothing. How would he get out? He wanted to laugh but couldn't. Right now, he didn't want to think about anything. He just wanted to go to sleep. But the pond water was really too cold, so cold it reached his heart. This wasn't a good place to sleep. Why was it that every time he would torment himself so much? Forcing himself alert, he gritted his teeth and entered mediation. He wanted to know what his situation really was like. The Ling energy in his body abruptly appeared in front of him. He was first struck dumb and then was overjoyed. Zuji. He had completed Juji. Internal vision. This was internal vision. In a trance, he saw the three-dimensional diagram of the Ling energy moving through his body. Each strand of Ling energy was so clear for him to see. He felt as though he could see all objects, his mind becoming clear. Zuaremo didn't know how long it was until his thoughts refocused. He hurriedly inspected his Ling energy again, and to his surprise, he found his Ling energy was 3 times what it had been originally been. No wonder the distance between the 10th level of Lianqi and Zhuji was a great canyon. It really was a canyon. He had just entered Zhuji and his cultivation had increased 3 times. Think of the power disparity. It might have been caused by excess happiness, but the pain from his body seemed to lessen greatly. Zuaremo struggled out of the bottom of the pond and floated towards the top. When his head came out of the water, he couldn't help sucking in a breath. He hadn't thought that he would really make it through the fire dragon grass. Even now, he was still somewhat in disbelief. Fire dragon grass was something that only terrifying and abnormal people like Shixiang could endure. But he actually made it through. But he still had lingering fears. The danger involved could be deduced from the pain of his entire body. But he finally made it through. He opened his mouth and wanted to laugh but found that his throat was dry and painful, unable to make a sound. His hands pushed against the side of the pond, trying to climb out. His body shuddered in great pain and almost made him faint. With no other solution, he could only use his hands to grab a rock beside the pond, his body soaking in the water. The joy after surviving a calamity made everything seem so beautiful. After a long time, the pain lessened slightly and his strength had slightly recovered. Struggling to climb out of the pond, he found the jade scrolls and other times scattered on the ground. He carefully picked them all up. What really made him feel pain was that 3rd-grade spirit traveling seal. It had burnt down to only a small scrap. Did his body really combust? He still remembered the strong feeling of burning before he became unconscious, but that was all he remembered. Thankfully, most of his belongings, like talismans and jade sticks, were still undamaged. But since the spirit traveling seal was gone, and he was naked, how would he get back to West Wind Valley? Suddenly, he had an idea. Casting Little Art of Cloud and Rain, he saw a white ball of clouds appear in front of him. He snickered, his hands maintaining the spell as his body sneaked into the cloud. Oh, cold, very comfortable. Very quickly, he found that the pain in his body seemed to have lessened slightly. Did Little Art of Cloud and Rain have healing properties? But this wasn't the time to study it. He should think of a way to get back. Old Black had finished his work in the fields and was preparing to return home. Walking on the road, he couldn't help but ponder what he had just seen. Thinking about it now, he felt his heart tremble. Stars appearing during daytime. There were many strange things in the world, natural abnormalities. Was this a bad omen? He couldn't help but raise his head. In the blue sky, other than the sun, there was nothing else. Old Black exhaled. Normal was good, normal was good. Normality was the best. Please don't have any change. As he thought aimlessly, he walked back towards his residence. Where he was living now was the big yard that Zuaremo had lived in previously. Detecting that someone was coming opposite him, he raised his head. At a glance, he was pinned to the ground, his expression dumbstruck. After a pause, he recovered and stammered, "Little Emo, Zuemo was completely shrouded in a white cloud. Only his head was left sticking out. Looking down, Old Black could barely make out a pair of bare feet. Old Black felt this white cloud seemed familiar. He suddenly realized, wasn't this the cloud from Little Art of Cloud and Rain? Was he taking a bath? Thinking about the rain of Little Art of Cloud and Rain, Old Black felt that this creativity was pretty good. But he didn't need to bathe on the mountain road and wash as he kept on walking. Zuemo was extremely embarrassed and wanted to find a crack in the ground to hide himself. But due to his zombie face, there wasn't any bashfulness, no embarrassment. He seemed very at ease. His entire body was in pain. Any movement, and the pain would pierce his heart. He could only laboriously move his feet step by step. Old Black decided to give a compliment. He reached out with his thumb. Little Emo, this trick is great. Zuemo felt that there weren't any words that could describe his feelings right now. He could only nod his head solemnly in acknowledgement and then slowly walk down the path. Looking at the back of the white ball slowly moving, even Old Black couldn't help but feel that little Emoji's bearing had really improved. What made Zuemo feel hopeless was that he had encountered quite a few outer sect disciples as he made his way. Their strange gazes made Zuemo's hair stand up. When he reached West Wind Valley, he almost wept tears of joy. But when he appeared at the gates of his own little yard, the gray-beaked goose at the rooftop was suddenly alarmed and quickly used its wings to cover its eyes. Zuemo's heart instantly shattered into countless pieces, landing on the ground. So this gray bird was female? What made Zuemo feel depressed was that this female bird sneakily created a small opening through her wings and peeped through from behind. And what made his teeth itch even more was that this female bird's gaze turned from curious to disdainful. Damn bird! Humiliated, Zuemo angrily sent out a sword energy. The gray-beaked goose shouted in alarm and nimbly dodged. It flew into the air and then suddenly extended its neck, full of disdain as it spat at the ground. Zuemo almost fainted in anger. He threw out hatefully, "You are a dead bird, just wait." What he was thankful for was that he hadn't encountered an elder on his way. If Master saw his state, she would beat him halfway to death and throw him down the mountain to feed the dogs. Laboriously moving into the room, he collapsed on the bed. He didn't want to move, he didn't want to think, didn't want to move a fingertip. He was exhausted. Very quickly, he slipped into a deep sleep. Before sleeping, he lightly muttered, "Zhuji." Chapter 47 Shixiang Su-yi. Waking up, Zuemo almost couldn't open his eyes in the bright sunlight. He gave a comfortable groan. The soreness made his entire body feel relaxed. He wanted to keep sleeping. After struggling for a moment, he still decided to get up. In Zhuji, there really wasn't any need for sleep. But other than to recover strength, sleep's most important purpose was to let the mind rest. In the sunlight, he stretched out his spine, his entire skeleton cracking like popcorn. Zuemo instantly was frightened and quickly inspected his body. Not finding any problems, his heart was then reassured. He always felt that he muddled through all his breakthroughs. He never had the knowledge of what happened. Like Little Art of Cloud and Rain, going to the 4th level, embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, breaking into one breath, it was all like this. This time wasn't an exception. Other than these crisp sounds, and the increase in cultivation, he had not found any other benefits that Zhuji had brought. He was too greedy. Zuemo laughed at himself. Just in the increase in cultivation was enough for him to receive countless benefits. Walking out of the room, Zuemo, after the calamity, felt that the warm sunlight was all the more precious. Even the damn bird on the rooftop wasn't as terrible in his eyes as yesterday. Suddenly stopping, he took a deep breath. The slightly spread 10 fingers suddenly moved, creating an afterimage. His gaze was focused, his 10 fingers coming alive, darting quickly. The complicated transformations would dazzle a person's eyes. After learning Art of Flora, a spell that prioritized finger movements, this almost became one of his most practiced spells. There wasn't too many spells to practice in Lianqi involving manipulation of Ling energy. Like Little Art of Cloud and Rain, Zuemo had almost practiced it to the limits of what a Lianqi cultivator could do. And how to use spiritual power, he didn't have one word of instruction and couldn't even touch the doorway. The only thing that time could be spent upon, and that he felt useful, were finger movements. Therefore, Art of Flora, that used finger movements was his only choice. The increase in cultivation didn't cause an evident increase in the finger movements. This point raised Zhuomo's attention. Zhuji was only the first stage in the journey of cultivation. The dangers of the road ahead, only trying it personally could lead to understanding. His goal, from a long time ago, it wasn't earning Jingshi or just living anymore. To search for the answer, then what was required was sufficient strength. Even Master, a Jindan, was cautious when speaking of the guy that had changed his features and erased his mind. How powerful the other's power must be. In other words, at the least, he needed power that surpassed his master. Master was a Jindan? Zhuomo took a deep breath, raised his expressionless face, and the hands that had been at his sides silently turned to fists. It was very far enough to make him feel it was impossible. There were countless cultivators. How many would become Jindan? To say of nothing else, but in the second generation of the entire sect, the only one that had hopes of becoming Jindan was Wei Xingxixiang. Himself? A guy that only had some talent in the area of 5 elements. If it was becoming a strong Ling plant farmer, Zhuomo didn't have any doubts of whether he could achieve it. But achieving Jindan, his most optimistic prediction was only just a hope of 1 in 10,000. After he learned of his changed features and erased mind, he had continuously asked himself, was it really worth it to pursue after such an illusory and distant goal? Right now, as a Ling plant farmer, his life would become better and better. If he formed a relationship with someone, his own descendants would have a pretty good life. But this, gambling his living, his life, to pursue that goal that had almost no chance of winning, was it worth it? Whenever he started to sway, he would always think of that dream that frequently appeared, that kept on repeating even in death, you must not forget. Every time he would ask himself, what was it that he could not forget even if he died? He didn't know. He was a cowardly person. In order to live, he could flatter, could bow his spine, but he wanted to know. The change in his frame of mind caused the change in his attitude to his cultivation to change completely. He worked more, worked harder. He knew just how low his starting point was. He also knew that his own innate talents were not good. But he also knew he had his own advantages. Pu, even though he had cursed this damned perverse Renyao countless times, but Zhuomo still needed to thank him. Without Pu Yao, he couldn't even see a hint of sunlight. For this sliver of light, even if he had to pay some things, he was still willing. This time, Zhuji had been a painful ordeal for him. But for some reason his mental state became calmer, his thoughts clearer. Being a Ling plant farmer could dramatically increase his position in the sect, but clearly, a Ling plant farmer could not help him complete his goal. What he could rely on in this area was still sword scriptures. Ling plant farming, in the future, it was an important technique to earn Jingshi but not his main path of development. There were many paths to increase attack power, but of the many types of cultivation, the one with strongest attack power were sword cultivators. Even more, he was situated in a sword sect and naturally wouldn't abandon what was near to reach for the far. He might not have much talent with the sword, but he just needed to work harder. Thinking about sword cultivation, he remembered that after Zhuji, he could imprint a flying sword. Very quickly, he ran into difficulties. He didn't have a scripture for imprinting a flying sword. In Fragrant Ginger Yard, Shifeng Rong was shocked when she saw Zhuomo but instantly recovered. Even with Zhuji, you cannot be lazy. Go to the records room. You will be able to read some of the jade sticks. Coming out next time, I will personally test you. If you were lazy, there will be a heavy punishment. The last few words were extremely threatening. Zhuomo cowered under Master's scolding and could only murmur in affirmation. Inside, he wailed at his misfortune. It seemed he had hit Master's sore point somehow and couldn't help but wonder who had irritated Master. Only when Master's anger had decreased some did he cautiously open. Master, this disciple wants to request a scripture for impressing a flying sword. Impressing a flying sword? Shifeng Rong couldn't help but frown and said with some dissatisfaction, Your priority should be ling farming and dan making. Don't be greedy. Too greedy and you cannot digest it all. Don't you understand that? Zuermo heard this and grimaced. He just knew he wouldn't receive a good scripture. His mouth went, this disciple understands. But our Wukong sect is a sword sect. If this disciple doesn't know how to even impress a flying sword, walking out wouldn't it shame the sect? That's true. Hearing this, Shi Feng Rong thought it was reasonable. You can go see your Shixiang Su Yi and find a scripture to practice. Do not spend too much effort. Yes. Zuermo agreed docilely. Go. Shi Feng Rong discourteously sent him away. The stars in daytime that had appeared yesterday caused his mood to be bad to the extreme. She had heard some of the rumors about stars in daytime. There were all kinds of strange ones, but one point was unusually unanimous. That was, it wasn't a good thing. If this kind of incident had happened in one of the other Jie, she could go spectate, but since it happened in Tianyu Jie, her mood became bad. Especially when she saw the worry in her sect leader Shixiang's eyes, her mood became worse. She knew sect leader Shixiang very well. Sect leader Shixiang never was panicked. Since even he was worried this time, the situation probably was worse than she had imagined. If this lady knew who was the one behind all this, humph humph. Murderous intent flashed through her eyes, causing Su Qing at the side to jump in fright. Even as he left Fragrant Ginger Yard, Zuermo felt that his chest was heavy. He knew that Master was looking out for him, but he could not tell his reasons to Master. It seemed that he had thought too simply. Zuermo grimaced inside. Originally, he had assumed that if his contribution to the sect was large, the sect would naturally increase his benefits and he wouldn't have to worry about things like scriptures. Now he knew that he had expected too much. His benefits would naturally increase, but benefits were also sorted into areas. Things like spells were the very core of a sect. Would they easily give it to others? Right now, he could only hope for Wei Xing Shixiang to come out of the sword cave and teach him some moves. He still decided to take a trip to Su Yi Shixiang's place. He might not get a good spell, but he could seek a substitute. He'll take an average one. He had nothing in terms of sword scriptures. He was a page of white. Learning something would help his fundamentals. Humph, if the sect won't give, then he'll just buy it. If the Jingshi that he threw out was numerous enough, he would naturally be able to buy a pretty good sword scripture. Gu is a ling plant farmer. Am I someone that would lack for Jingshi? He completely forgot that his last piece of Jingshi had been extracted by Pu Yao. In the sea of consciousness, the sea of fire roared. If Zuermo came in, he would certainly be in for a fright. The dancing deep red flames had grown a section higher. The temperature of the ice river seemed to have decreased. And the biggest change was the star in the sky. Bright as a diamond, magnificent and dazzling. On the gravestone shrouded in the black clouds, Pu Yao lazily used his hand to support his perfect and flawless chin, the other hand rubbing a pile of powder, muttering to himself, used up all the Jingshi. This guy is really a piece of trash. Even getting a Jingshi requires almost killing himself. He said to the air, if I knew earlier, I'd have gone myself. Now it's great, you made the incident big, so many powerful guys have arrived from outside. Even dead, you're still making trouble for me. It really is inflexible to the death. The white powder dribbled from the cracks in his hands. A lonely Yao sat on the gravestone and said ruefully, the landlord doesn't have any surplus either. In the Hall of Hearing Principles, Su Yi was slightly shocked when he saw Zuermo but quickly recovered his composure. He smiled opening, it's a rare occasion for Shitty to come. Come sit. Zuermo looked at Su Yi Shixiang. The other was a person that he had admired very much when he had been an outer sect disciple. He had never thought that he could sit on equal ground with him now. The affairs of the world, it really was fickle. He couldn't help but sigh. Zuermo has to thank Shixiang for guidance in the past. He sincerely gave a bow. Su Yi blanked and then hurried to help Zuermo up. Shitty doesn't have to be so courteous. That was just my duty. After this exchange of words, both felt that they were much closer to each other. It's rare for Shitty to come, have a taste of my tea. Su Yi's hands twisted, a set of tea equipment appeared in front of him. A yellow bamboo tea tray carved with two clouds. Simple and humble. On top was a purple clay teapot. The light flashed across the purple clay teapot. Formations clearly were carved on it. 7 small cups like the 7 stars of the Northern Dipper. Su-yi took out a square jade box. When it was opened, Zhuo felt a fragrance spread towards him. The box was half full with ling tea. The ling tea was as green and bright as jade. It was a branch with 3 leaves clustered at the end, tender and glistening. This is fragrance tea, Su-yi introduced, produced by the Ivy Aromatic Shop. It took a lot of effort to buy this. Then he gave a smile. I don't have any other indulgences, just this one. Su-yi Shixiang's eyes were focused as his hands skillfully started to wash the pot and cups. When had Zhuo ever seen such things? His eyes widened, unblinking. He saw Su-yi Shixiang first take out a small amount of tea leaves to put into the purple clay pot, pour in cold spring water, and then the thumb and index finger of the right hand gently pinched. A red flame floated in front of him. The movements of Shixiang's long and white fingers were extremely gentle as he gently placed this red flame inside the purple clay pot. Hiss splat, hiss splat. Inside the purple clay pot, countless water droplets exploded. The spring water inside the pot became a ball of green mist, yet not a drop spilled. Su-yi Shixiang quickly lifted the teapot and a rush of green tea poured into the teacup. Inside the teacup, the tea soup was green and enticing. A fragrance completely different than the one before wafted out. Drink quickly, the effect wouldn't be as good if it's cold. Su-yi Shixiang's expression was solemn. He directly held up a cup and put it to his mouth. Copying Shixiang, Zhuo also picked up a cup. Mimicking Shixiang, whose expression was intoxicated as he sipped, he also took a drink. Boom. It was impossible to describe the feeling that occurred the instant the tea soup touched the tongue. It was as though countless flavors had gathered and exploded at once inside the mouth. At the same time, Zhuo's tears and snot streamed out. Seeing Zhuo's sorry state, Su-yi almost choked on a sip of tea and then grinned widely. Zhuo couldn't care about Shixiang's laughter. All of his attention was on pondering this strange feeling. A rush of coolness spread through his limbs, his body unspeakably light. All the pores seemed to have opened, so comfortable he could groan. This tea soup has dense ling energy. You just entered Juji, this is good to stabilize your level. Su-yi reminded. Hearing this, Zhuo hurriedly swallowed the remaining tea soup, got into lotus position and entered meditation. Looking at Zhuo's gulps, Su-yi Shixiang only shook his head, seemingly dissatisfied with Zhuo wasting such a good thing. With a small mouthful after another, a face full of pleasure, he slowly drank. When Zhuo woke up from mediation, he felt his body refreshed and unspeakably comfortable. He didn't waste words and raised his hands to Su-yi Shixiang. Many thanks, Shixiang. Su-yi waved his hand, just invited Shidi to drink tea. Coming this time, Shidi must have a matter. Zhuo narrated how he had requested a spell for impressing a flying sword from his master. Hearing this, Su-yi nodded, I understand. I hadn't thought that since Shidi had received the jade medal, you still want to cultivate the sword. I'm just playing around, Zhuo hurriedly replied. After being cracked down by Master, he felt it was better not to say anything. A man wanting to improve the sword, it isn't something embarrassing. Wielding a sword in the world, kill Yao and exterminate Mo, it is amazing. Shixiang had been like this before, but later, found that my talents were average and hard to achieve anything, so turned to learning forging. Su-yi first laughed at himself and then said seriously, since Shidi is interested in the sword, Shixiang has spent some more time in the sect, so knows a bit more, and can chat about it with Shidi. When Zhuo heard, kill Yao and exterminate Mo, he couldn't help but grimace bitterly inside. Thinking about the perverse Ren Yao, he felt it was more likely that he would be killed and exterminated. But he still said solemnly, thank you Shixiang. Chapter 48 The Black-Hearted Records Room. Our sect is a sword sect. Our strongest sword scripture is the Void Sword Scripture that our founder created. But our sect had gradually declined. This sword scripture that had been ranked 6th grade could not be learned by anyone in the sect. Somehow, after that, It was split into a shapeless sword scripture and empty sword scripture. The one that Luo Li Shidi practices is empty sword scripture. But these two scriptures that were split only reach 3rd grade. Other than this, the other one of importance is Master's Ice Dragon Sword Scripture. This sword scripture is a 4th grade sword scripture. In the hands of Master, it blossomed and managed to enter the ranks of 5th grade. In the past, it was with this sword scripture that Master had killed countless Yaoma in Yao Hunt and received the title of Ice Dragon Sword. As he talked about his master Xan Yen, Su Yi wandered away in his thoughts. A 4th grade sword scripture that was able to elevate into 5th grade, it was enough to show that Xan Yen Shirshu's abilities with Ice Dragon Sword Scripture didn't just reach deeply, but that he had improved this sword scripture. No one who was able to do this was ordinary. Other than this, the ancestors of our sect were also skilled. Cloud Sword Scripture, Red Flame Sword Scripture, Emerald Sword Scripture, they are all 4th grade. Huh, Shidi, don't just think that our sect doesn't have any reputation in Dongfu. But in Dongfu, other than Dongfu Hall, only we have a 6th grade sword scripture. Even 4th grade scriptures, not just any sect in Dongfu has one. Zuomo's eyes widened. He had never thought that the sect was so strong. Sui noticed Zuomo's eyes and smiled. Shidi, don't think too optimistically. Sword scriptures above 4th level, the sect wouldn't easily pass it on to the disciples. What the sect leader and the Shirshu believe is better to have nothing than accept a shoddy choice. In the past, Luo Li Shidi was unparalleled in the 2nd generation, but even so, he was only passed on the 3rd grade sword scripture, empty sword scripture. Seeing the disappointment in Zuomo's eyes, he comforted, Shidi, don't be too disappointed. There are very fine ones among the 3rd grade sword scriptures. Like the empty sword scripture that Luo Li Shidi learned, and that shapeless sword scripture that also came from void sword scripture. They are the extreme best among 3rd grade sword sections. Shidi, you have to pay attention. They might all be 3rd grade sword scriptures, but there are still differences. Zuo instantly raised his ears. It was too hard to pursue those good ones, but he shouldn't pick the worst ones. He was very practical. The item less a bit, but the Jingshi difference wouldn't just be a bit. Usually, 5-element sword scriptures are the worst. Shidi is a ling plant farmer and your understanding of the 5 elements definitely is deeper than mine. The 5 elements encompass millions of changes yet lose their purity. To cultivate the sword, what cannot be lost is purity. But the 5 elements birth and defeat each other, and are difficult to make pure. I had never heard of a 5-element sword scripture that went above 3rd grade. Shidi, don't try to pick this kind of sword scripture. The other sword scriptures, they all have their attributes. Some are fierce and powerful, good for killing and battle. Some are strange and unpredictable, good for ambushing. Some nurture the mind and increase cultivation. Nurture the mind? Aren't sword scriptures primarily for killing? How can it nurture the mind? Zuo couldn't help asking. Haha, cultivation is long and difficult. If there isn't a strong and resolute heart, how can one achieve the path? To use the sword to nurture the heart, to harden the core. Many people practice this kind of sword scripture. Like me, I have Heaven Heart sword scripture. This kind of sword scripture, it doesn't have much power but to nurture and fix the mind, it's pretty good. Su Yi smiled as he explained. The sect records at Riverside Peak. You are an inner sect disciple now and can go in to read. But it requires contribution points each time. If Shidi has spare time, remember to earn more sect contribution points. In the future, you'll need to use them. Su Yi emphasized. Bidding farewell to Su Yi Shixiang, Zuo headed straight for Riverside Peak. There was a river below Riverside Peak. The mountain was steep, and so the records room was built against the cliff. It wasn't big, just a small compound. There were some thin bamboo stalks planted beside the walls, the outer walls slightly crumbling. Zuo was somewhat disappointed. He had never been here before. This place was only open to inner sect disciples. The person guarding the door was an old one. At the beginning, Zuo fantasized that the other was some high master, but he was quickly disappointed. This old man guarding the door only had a cultivation of Lianqi 9th level. However, Zuoemo didn't dare to disrespect him. The common saying was good, the existing official wasn't as good as the existing manager. Don't just look at how bad the old man's cultivation was, but he guarded the records room. If he wanted to make trouble, it was a very easy thing to do. Respectfully handing over his medal, the old man scanned it and lowered down his face, saying, 2 hours on the first level is 2 contribution points, 2 hours on the second floor is 4 contribution points. The jade scrolls in the first level can be copied. The second level is restricted from copying. Go in. He threw the medal back to Zuoemo. So black. Zuoemo swore inside. The contribution points of inner sect disciples were not the same as outer sect disciples, and they could not be converted. Zuoemo only had in total 10 contribution points. 5 of them had been the reward the sect leader gave him for receiving the jade medal. The other 5 were from last time when he let Yen Le Shu sell his plants. 10 contribution points. It was enough for him to stay 10 hours on the first floor and 5 on the second. If it was copying a jade scroll, even the most basic would be 2 or so hours. And if it couldn't be copied, then it had to be memorized. That wasn't something that could be accomplished in a few hours. Now he understood why Su Yi Shixiang reminded him to earn more contribution points. So the big cost was here. He was suddenly grateful that the Dan-making records room of his master didn't require contribution points. Otherwise, he could only cry. Zuoemo guessed that Xen Yen Shu definitely would have a private forging records room. Otherwise, Su Yi Shixiang would be in a terrible bind. Time was tight and didn't allow Zuoemo to think. He ran straight into the first floor. He saw rows of jade scrolls, organized neatly. Zuoemo couldn't help twist his mouth. From what he saw, this was much worse than Master's records room. A layer of dust had accumulated on the wooden boards. It looked like there usually weren't many people. Even though it lacked care, but the arrangement of the jade scrolls was easy to follow. There were all kinds of jade scrolls. Sword scriptures, 5 elements, cultivation scriptures, forging. These were the jade scrolls that the elders of the sect that searched and gathered over the generations. The grade of these jade scrolls weren't high, didn't have much practical value, but it would have been a pity to throw them out, so the sect had created a records room to support the inner sect members to study. This kind of jade scrolls were only useful to those who had just become an inner sect disciple. As they spent longer with their master, the worth of these jade scrolls would decrease. It had been a long time since Wukong Sword Sect had new inner sect disciples come in. After Li Yingfeng became an inner sect disciple, she spent each day with Yen Le Shu taking care of all the different business. And after Wei Xing Shixiang became an inner sect disciple, he received Xen Yen Shu's meticulous teachings and then entered the sword cave, therefore he naturally didn't come here. So when Zuoemo came in, he saw this dusty scene. Even though there wasn't high-level spells, but the roomful of jade scrolls still made Zuoemo's eyes turn dizzy and drool. Don't just think that these jade scrolls weren't important. If they were thrown onto the market, each one could be sold for a pretty good price. 4 Lianqi disciples, each jade scroll would be a treasure. Zuoemo headed straight for the sword scriptures. It was also the largest topic on the first floor. Wukong Sword Sect was a sword sect, so naturally, it would put all possible effort into gathering sword scriptures. There were large numbers of 2nd and 3rd grade sword scriptures on the first floor. Naturally, they weren't of high quality. After making a cursory examination, he quickly put them down. As expected, there was nothing really good. It wasn't bad as a reference, but for a primary method, it wasn't really good. Looking at the stars for the 2nd floor, he hesitated a second and then decided to go up to see. The 2nd floor was slightly smaller and there was a dramatically smaller number of jade scroll. But the scene was very similar to Master's records room. The jade scrolls were all floating in midair, each jade scroll surrounding by differently colored whirlpools. Having had a similar experience, Zuoemo naturally knew what to do. He scanned through the jade scrolls about sword scriptures one by one. Even now, he still hadn't decided what kind of sword scripture to cultivate. If it had been before, he might have chosen to be like Su Yi Shixiang and practice something like Sky Heart Sword Scripture. This kind of sword scripture cultivated the resolve of the cultivator, something that was crucial. However, for him that was pursuing strength, finding those sword scriptures that had greater power was more realistic. Undecided, Zhuo flipped and read through them one by one. He had never seen so many jade scrolls at the same time. The jade scrolls from the second level, if it had been in the past, they would all have been treasures that he would have dreamed about. He couldn't help but feel as though he was in a dream. As expected, the sword scriptures that Su Yi Shixiang had mentioned were all absent. The second floor were entirely third-grade sword scriptures but were distinctively of higher quality than the jade scrolls downstairs. They should be the finest of the third grade. There was a set of wind and thunder sword scripture. After cultivating it, one would float like the wind, power like thunder, the effectiveness shocking. Supposedly it had originally been a 5th-grade sword scripture, but after continuous loss over thousands of years, its power declined and it was demoted to 3rd grade. And another even stranger was Autumn Rain sword scripture. It required a set of 108 swords. The moves were like rain, extremely difficult to block. But just like Wind and Thunder sword scripture, much of its contents had been lost, especially the method of making the swords. The power of each individual sword dropped dramatically and it entered an awkward state. But its manipulations were very exquisite, so it was put on the 2nd floor. Each sword scripture had its unique strengths, but similarly, they all had a great flaw. Seeing that the jade scrolls he hadn't read become less and less, Zhuo started to become panicked. Was he unable to find an appropriate sword scripture for himself? He completely forgot that time was flowing away. As the number of the jade scrolls decreased one by one, his heart started to sink to the bottom bit by bit. At last, he was facing the last jade scroll. Li Water sword scripture. Li Water, these two characters clearly connected to the 5 elements caused Zhuo's heart to jump. Su Yi Shixiang's words were by his ears. Shixiang had kept reminding him of the weak nature of 5-element sword scriptures. Zhuo, who had a rough understanding of the 5 elements, was very clear just how correct Shixiang was. The 5 elements had many transformations, but it was hard to purify. If the sword essence was not pure, then the power would decrease. Completely disheartened, Zhuo unconsciously read Li Water sword scripture. He suddenly found something and his mind roused itself. Just as he wanted to take a closer look, his eyes suddenly flashed and then he found himself standing in the yard. Time has ended. You have used all your contribution points. The old man's eyelids didn't even raise as he gave a dismissal. Zhuo wanted to cry. Chapter 49 Purchase Order. Spending 10 contribution points but not a spell to show for it, Zhuo felt like a fool. Enraged, Zhuo raised his head to look at the decrepit building before marching away without a second glance. Humph, when ye has contribution points, ye will lie down on the 1st floor, lie down on the 2nd, sleep every day here. Zhuo didn't feel good but was helpless. Very quickly, his brain turned to how to earn Jingshi. The contribution points of inner sect disciples were not easy to earn. Previously, when he had been an outer sect disciple, he had never been troubled by contribution points. But then he turned around his thinking. The contribution points of inner sect disciples were much more valuable than outer sect disciples. Before, no matter which jade scroll from the 2nd level, he would treat it like a treasure. When would he be so picky? There were many ways to earn contribution points. Just the ling grasses and herbs that Zhuo planted, and then if the sect sold them, they all would have contribution points. However, rules like the records room, Zhuo guessed, were common and there would be other places that would need to use contribution points. This question was very important and he needed to be clear. He ran to the Hall of Hearing Principles and found Su Yi Shixiang. After hearing Zhuo's words, Su Yi Shixiang explained, "Shidi thought correctly. Contribution points are more useful than Jingshi in the sect. Other than Void Sword Scripture, all the other spells in the sect, including Masters, Ice Dragon Sword Scripture, and the other 4th-grade sword scriptures can all be exchanged using contribution points. Of course, the amount of contribution points needed is astonishing. Other than spells, some high-quality items, like flying swords and talismans, can also be exchanged using contribution points. You can even use your contribution points to get my master to teach you the sword or forging. I can also pay using contribution points to let Shirgu teach me dan making. Basically, contribution points are omnipotent in the sect. Then how does Xixiang earn contribution points? Zuemo asked. I usually make some talismans for the sect for Yen Lu Shu to sell. Or I forge talismans for the other Shidi in exchange for some contribution points. If Shidi needs some talisman in the future, come find me. My price is much lower than the sect. Su Yi didn't give up a change to promote his own talismans and continued. Like Shidi, if you become skilled at dan making in the future, it would be very fast to earn contribution points. For other people, Luo Li Shidi might only be Zhuji, but he has achieved empty sword, and his attack power can compare to a cultivator in the initial stages of Ningmai. Most of his time is spent in the mines guarding the Xiu slaves. Underground is dark and uncomfortable, extremely dull. Other than Luo Li Shidi, no one is willing to go, so the contribution point that the sect gives him is extremely high. When Su Yi Xixiang mentioned Luo Li, Zuemo remembered something. In the second floor of the records room, I didn't see empty sword scripture and shapeless sword scripture. Shidi is in too much of a rush. These two sword scriptures, while they are third grade, but they are the finest among the third grade. It is also possible to find the shadow of void sword scripture from those two. The sect naturally is very cautious. When Shidi has spent more time in the sect, naturally you will be able to exchange for it. Zuemo understood. Leaving Su Yi Xixiang's place, Zuemo had a general idea of what he needed to do. It wasn't easy receiving contribution points in the sect. It seemed that his only realistic method right now was relying on planting ling plants. When he got to the entrance to the valley, he saw Li Yingfeng Shiji. He hurriedly greeted, "Why hasn't Shiji gone in?" The Jinji on Shidi's valley is very heavy. Shiji doesn't want to be too presumptuous. Li Yingfeng joked. Zuemo's heart jumped. Due to the fact that there was a ling vein beneath the rock room, he was very cautious and had set down layers of Jinji at the mouth of the valley. Looking at it now, it seemed very risky as it caught people's attention. He forced himself to calm, responding, "There are many ling grasses growing inside the valley. I'm afraid that some animals like rabbits and foxes would get it and damage the grasses. Then this little brother won't even have the time to cry." "That's true." Li Yingfeng nodded. "If ling grasses are ruined by those little animals, they wouldn't be worth anything. I actually have a jade scroll right now about Jinji. I'll send it over to Shidi since you can use it." Zuemo was overjoyed and gave a deep bow. "Many thanks, Shiji." "Shidi is too polite," she replied. "You and I both came up from the outer sect. It's rational for us to give mutual support." "Of course." Zuemo agreed. Both of them were clever people. This conversation quickly set down their relationship as allies. It might appear that everyone was good to him on the surface, but inner sect disciples that came from outer sect disciples usually would be pushed aside by the other inner sect disciples. Not just Wukong sword sect, almost all sects were like this. There weren't many second-generation disciples in Wukong sword sect, and most of them were outside. Other than Luo Li and Hao Min, eldest Xixiang Qincheng, eldest Shiji Gong Sun Qing, and third Shiji Su Yixia were all not in the sect. The battle over eldest Xixiang between Wei Sheng and Qincheng was undoubtedly the focal point. If nothing unexpected happened, it was almost set in stone that Wei Sheng would supplant Qincheng as eldest Xixiang. But Qincheng was also a disciple of the sect leader, and after being eldest Xixiang for this many years, he was well loved by the other second-generation disciples. Eldest Shiji Gong Sun Qing supposedly was engaged to a disciple in a certain large sect. She wouldn't be spending too much time in the sect, but her influence in the sect was the greatest among all second-generation disciples. She could even influence the sect leader. This was probably due to her fiancé. Third Shiji Su Yixia was deeply loved by all the Shirshu. Yen Lu Shirshu had meant for her to take over his work. However, her personality was lively and carefree, uninterested in business. Zuemo sighed ruefully. No place was spared from conflict. Many times, it wasn't a question of whether you fought or not. He and Li Yingfeng weren't unfamiliar with these matters. The outer sect disciples fought even more viciously, the little groups as plentiful as trees in a forest. Both of them were experienced. Zhuo Mo had went from being bullied by all at the beginning to the end where everyone flattered him. From an outsider perspective, his experiences went deep. And Li Yingfeng, to become the top dog of the Eastern Peak female disciples, there were no doubts to her abilities. Zhuo Mo saw it very clearly. Wei Xing Shixiang might be the leader of the three of them, but on these matters, Shixiang wouldn't pay attention. Other than the sword, Shixiang was indifferent and unconcerned with other matters. Zhuo Mo was certain that Shixiang would be happy not to be eldest Shixiang. That way, he could concentrate on cultivation. Shixiang might not have to consider these things, but he couldn't not consider. Shixiang's talents and power was displayed there. Even Qin Cheng would treat Shixiang with the utmost respect. But Li Yingfeng and his circumstances would be much trickier. There was a large difference between good and bad. Li Yingfeng was also very satisfied with the tacit understanding between the two of them and thought inside, this Zhuo Mo Shidi's appearance might be frightening, but he had a clever heart. A clever companion was much better than a stupid one. Some things only need to be touched upon. She changed the topic, coming this time, it's to deliver Jingshi to Shidi. This was undoubtedly the words that Zhuo Mo liked to hear the most. He instantly became alert. Oh, how much? This is 76 second grade Jingshi. That's after taking away the down payment. Li Yingfeng handed Zhuo Mo a jade scroll. This has the detailed accounts. Shidi can take it back for a look. Zhuo Mo took the jade scroll, his happiness unrivaled. The profit this time far surpassed his expectations. Suddenly remembering a matter, Li Yingfeng asked, "Does Shidi still have some of the great strength pill?" Great strength pill? If Li Yingfeng hadn't mentioned it, Zhuo Mo had almost forgotten that Lingdan. Last time, a cultivator had brought it. 2 days ago, he came asking if there was any more. He wants to buy another 10. Each 120 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. Yingfeng said, 10 pills. Each 120 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. In total, 200 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. That was 2 third-grade Jingshi. Zhuo Mo seemed to see countless Jingshi flying towards him. This was the biggest order he had received up until now. 2 pieces of third-grade Jingshi. The raw materials for great strength pill were only 3 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. With 20 pieces of second-grade Jingshi as the sale price, the profit from 1 pellet reached 17 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. No wonder his heart was beating so frantically. His only worry right now was the success rate. He had accidentally made great strength pill. He wasn't certain that he could successfully make it. I'll try first. He was still very cautious. If Shidi gets results, tell me anytime. Finishing, Li Yingfeng left. Seeing Shiji leave, Zhuo Mo instantly rushed into the valley, flipped onto the gray-beaked goose to rush for fragrant ginger yard. 1 pill was 20 pieces of second-grade Jingshi. This was almost half of his income every year in the past. Entering fragrant ginger yard, he brought a pile of materials to make the great strength pill from Su Qing Shiji, and then burrowed into the Dan room. Nothing would make him more enthusiastic than Jingshi. He didn't start the process immediately but sat down first and thought back to every action that occurred last time. When his emotions had calmed down, he then folded his legs to enter meditation and started embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. For hours later, he woke up from meditation. The face was frozen like it was dead, but the eyes were clear and serene. Zhuo Mo's mind was peaceful, completely absent of the glee he had before. His consciousness, mind and Ling energy were all at their best. Putting the raw materials for great strength pill into the cauldron, Zhuo Mo's hands touched the 8 trigrams plate and his consciousness silently spread out. Adding in Ling energy, the Li fire seal formation on the Dan-making cauldron suddenly started, the Ling energy inside the cauldron twisting and turning. In the middle of the process, Zhuo Mo's spell changed and Art of Crimson Flame was cast at full force. A gold line dropped into his hands from the sky. Then its direction was deflected and it entered the cauldron. Up until now, nothing was different compared to last time. Zhuomo's heart relaxed slightly. Just before, when he had thought back to every action in great detail, but last time, it had basically been an accident that had created this strange Lingdan. He was muddled about many places and didn't remember clearly. Suddenly, his heart jumped and he cried misfortune. The Ling energy inside the cauldron was vibrating abnormally. As expected, a sharp and burnt smell spread through the Dan room. Zhuo had made enough mental preparations. It wasn't too difficult to accidentally make a new kind of Lingdan. What that needed was luck. But to actually grasp the method for making the Lingdan, that was knowledge. Anything that required study, it had to be built from the ground up. There were no tricks. He knew the general idea, the basic steps, and the raw materials. There was also enough profit. Was there anything other than this that was more appropriate for a greenhorn like Zhuo? As to the difficulties involved, Zhuo wasn't afraid. In this world, was there something good that would earn Jingshi without any difficulty? Chapter 50, Finding the Way. After 3 continuous failures, Zhuo had to stop experimenting. Even though he had sufficient wealth at this point, but it wasn't enough for him to squander it. He had to plan it out and spend wisely. 3 continuous failures. That meant there was a crucial step that he had missed. He entered into deep thought. What he didn't know was that the difficulty of this matter far surpassed the limits of what he could cope with. He had swallowed down some records, but in the area of Dan making, he was the newest of the new. His experience was almost zero. Going through speculations to find the basic changes in a certain part of the Dan making process, many cultivators that were far more experienced may not be able to do it. But no one had told Zhuo this point. If Zhuo knew this, he most likely would have thrown the matter to the side. Why was he making great strength pill? It was for Jingshi. If it was too difficult, the risk too high, it wasn't profitable. Then he should go to find a more realistic method. He wasn't afraid of difficulty, he was afraid that his ignorance and those questions that were far out of his level would be tangled together. In Zhuo's eyes, that was an unprofitable business. But Zhuo hadn't realized that the problem he was facing was out of his range. He twisted his brain as he thought in the Dan room. In the sword cave, not even the fingers on a hand could be made out. The rock underneath the feet was ice cold, the blood river not far away roiled relentlessly. Wei Sheng panted heavily and couldn't persevere any longer, falling to the ground to enter mediation. The exhaustion between his brows were unable to be disguised. He made a sorry figure, half naked, about 10 or so scars crisscrossing, alarming to the eye. On his lower half, there was only a short length of pants. He quickly entered mediation, almost immediately after sitting down. In meditation, Wei Sheng's spine was as straight as a sword, a few hints of dignity and imposingness faintly appearing through his serene appearance. Time slipped away, yet he remained motionless. A black shadow quietly neared Wei Sheng. In mediation, Wei Sheng did not detect it. Suddenly, the black shadow leapt at Wei Sheng. In mediation, Wei Sheng unexpectedly opened his eyes. With an unknown move, a green sword energy flashed in the dark and the shadow was split in half. Sweet. The scream the black shadow gave was dissonant as it turned into black smoke and disappeared without a trace. Wei Sheng stood up from the cold rock ground, his face unaffected. In his eyes were an eternal resolve. Barely visible was sword essence roiling behind. In the silence and darkness, he raised his bare foot, following the blood river, as he slowly and steadily headed deeper. In a place extremely far away from Tianyujia. Stars in daytime, yes. This matter has alarmed many people. There are already many that are rushing to investigate in Tianyujia. Some people say that stars in daytime is a great treasure appearing. Great treasure appearing? The person who spoke had heavy disdain. People die for wealth, bird die for food. This rationale is unchanging. Then we send someone. Pay attention to this matter. The person who spoke gave an unquestionable order. Yes. In the fragrant ginger yard of Wukong Mountains, seeing Shi Feng Rong come out of the Dan room, Su Qin hurriedly followed. She could become the first seat of the outer sect disciples of Fragrant Ginger Yard. One point was she was obedient and could listen, and she was reliable at her job. The other important reason was that she could tolerate Shifeng Rong's strange temper. Shifeng Rong looked at the surroundings and furrowed her brows. "Where's your Shixiang?" Su Qing hurried responded. "After Shixiang entered the Dan room a few days ago, he hasn't come out." "Dan room? What Dan is he making?" Shifeng Rong's brow smoothed as she asked casually. It seemed that Zuemo was really focused on Dan making. She was very satisfied. "It's probably fasting pills. Shixiang had bought some materials for fasting pills for me a few days ago." Su Qing answered. She had been at Fragrant Ginger Yard for a long time and her experience in the area of Dan was much deeper than Zuemo fasting pills. Shifeng Rong's brows furrowed again as she said discontent. "Why is he still making fasting pills now? How can he improve that way?" Fasting pills were the most basic Dan. It couldn't even be considered a Ling Dan. As a Zhuji cultivator, it was a very comical thing to spend effort on that. Su Qing's heart jumped and she regretted what she had just said. If Shixiang was punished by Shishu because of what she said, it would be bad for her. As she spoke, Shifeng Rong moved in front of the door to Zuemo's Dan room. Without knocking, she pushed open the door. Once the door was open, a thick and choking burning smell rushed out. Shifeng Rong's expression became even uglier. Failure at making fasting pills? Was it that the 5 fasting pills last time had been brought to deceive her? Her expression became dark. Zuemo was like a puppet, blankly sitting on the ground. He didn't even notice Shifeng Rong and Su Qing entering. Shifeng Rong noticed that Zuemo's empty eyes were full of blood and the rage inside slightly decreased. She could see that Zuemo was deep in thought. Suppressing the fire inside, she didn't disturb Zuemo, walking straight to the waste piled beside the cauldron. It really was the materials for fasting pills. She was sure after one look. The rage inside instantly shot up again. She decided that later she would have Zuemo make one in front of her. Her gaze was just going to move away from the waste when it suddenly stopped. She bent down and started to flip through the waste, and occasionally took up a bit to examine carefully. Su Qing was so envious. She sighed. Inner sect disciples were really inner sect disciples. She had spent so many years at Fragrant Ginger Yard, but had never seen Shishu been this concerned for another disciple. Zuemo only managed to wake up at this time. Seeing that 2 more people were in his Dan room, the fire that had formed due to his struggles shot up. It was common knowledge that the Dan room wasn't a place that others were allowed to enter, especially when making Dan. That could easily cause the Dan to fail. But when he saw who the person was, the curses that had reached his mouth instantly shrunk back into his stomach. Danger! It's a catastrophe! He hurriedly stood up and respectfully gave a bow to Shifeng Rong. "Master? You are making that Ling Dan from last time?" Shifeng Rong's head didn't even rise as she unconcernedly crouched by the waist. "Yes." Zuemo obediently answered, "But I haven't succeeded once yet." Shifeng Rong threw away the waste in her hands and stood up, the expression on her face cold. "When you don't know how to walk, you want to run?" Hearing this, Zuemo sweated and said, "Please, master, give me guidance." In the path of Dan making, the amount of ways to change the recipes involved, there are too many that cannot be passed on through just words. You should first follow the records. Form a good foundation before considering these matters. Finishing, Shifeng Rong left with a cold face. Returning to the Little West Wind Yard, Zuemo was extremely disheartened. He had thought that he had a method for earning lots of Jingshi, but it was really just a mirage, unable to be touched. In the next few days, Zuemo was somewhat dispirited. There were no Jingshi that could be earned, no contribution points that could be earned, no sword scriptures that could be practiced. With no other choice, Zuemo could only practice embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation. Sitting above the Ling vein in the rock room, Zuemo woke up from meditation. Embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, which had always progressed rapidly, had started to slow down recently. This was the first time that Zuemo had encountered something like this after breaking through 1 breath. Was he going to break through 2 breaths? According to the records in embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, After one breath was two breath. If one could achieve two breath, not only would the entire body's points be able to breathe, but at that time, his presence could be restrained. Many people that had higher cultivations wouldn't be able to detect it. This spell was much better than those concealing spells recorded in Elder Wei Nan's jade sticks. Thinking about that, Zhou Emo suddenly remembered that Elder Wei Nan had made Dan and was a ling plant farmer. Would he have met similar problems? Once the idea was seated, he hurriedly took out the jade sticks and looked carefully. As expected, he quickly made a discovery. In Elder Wei Nan's Dan-making experiences, Zhou Emo found a similar method. But what Elder Wei Nan used wasn't a fire method, but a rarely found water method. There were many methods to make ling dan and they all couldn't be counted. The most mainstream one right now was naturally using a cauldron, which was the fire method. The core of the fire method was using the power of the fire to stimulate the ling energy in the materials. Then the ling energy of different attributes would be merged together to form a ling dan. However, many ling herbs and grasses were of the yin attribute, like those ling grasses grown in water. If fire was used, it would ruin their effects. At this time, it required a different method such as the water method. Other than water and fire, there were still countless other methods of dan making. Water was warm and gentle, far from the fierceness and power of fire. So most water methods required a longer time to form dan. The path it walked was nurturing the dan. Only now did Zhou Emo know that the cold spring in the rock room had such a purpose. Before, he had completely dismissed the ling spring. He had wondered why Elder Wei Nan had made a spring in the rock room since after cultivators reached Zhuji, they almost didn't need to consume anything. The jade stick recorded a method that Elder Wei Nan used with little art of cloud and rain to make moisture dan. Moisture dan was a kind of dan that couldn't enter the grade. Its use was even more frivolous. It could change a person's appearance and skin, but it was only effective for cultivators with Lianqi 3rd level or below. This kind of dan that Zhou Emo felt had no use at all. After Elder Wei Nan used little art of cloud and rain to make it, it entered the rank of 1st grade. Its effectiveness had greatly improved. It could improve the features of cultivators that did not go above Zhuji. According to what the jade stick said, this became one of the important ways Elder Wei Nan made wealth. But due to the fact the time used in the water method, Elder Wei Nan only used this method for a period of time before switching to a different method. Different from Zhou Mo's accident, Elder Wei Nan's investigations were extremely thorough and were recorded very clearly. Elder Wei Nan though that the reason that those two could combine was due mostly to water. Little art of cloud and rain was the classic water element spell. It was naturally constructive when paired with the water method. There were also large amounts of records on his analysis of the reasons he failed. Zhou Emo pondered each character as he kept on reading, his thoughts becoming clearer. No wonder he could make great strength pill. Art of Crimson Flame belonged to fire, and the method the fasting pill used was the fire method. Using Art of Crimson Flame to collect the essence of the sun into the fasting pill that became the great strength pill. There was only one crucial point. Fire. Chapter 51. Attack Fire. The essence of Art of Crimson Flame was fire, and inside the cauldron was the leaf fire seal formation. This was the reason that Zhou Emo could make great strength pill. However, what Art of Crimson Flame condensed was essence of the sun, and unfortunately the fire that the leaf fire seal formation inside the cauldron provided was too low grade. Originally in the process, the leaf fire seal formation should have been the primary flame, and the essence of the sun that Art of Crimson Fire concentrated should have been the auxiliary. Right now, the sun essence was stronger than the leaf fire seal formation, so naturally problems would occur. He recognized where the problem was. Zhou Emo instantly had several ideas on how to solve it. The most feasible method was to lessen the sun essence concentrated by Art of Crimson Flame. The least feasible was changing the cauldron to a cauldron with a much higher grade leaf fire seal formation. And the boldest method was to change the relationship between primary and auxiliary, to have Art of Crimson Flame as primary, leaf fire seal formation as auxiliary. Zhou Emo chose the first option. He felt the possibility of success with the first one the highest. After thinking it through, he started to prepare. What he needed to do first was to be able to precisely control Art of Crimson Flame. Before this, he had never thought about accurately controlling Art of Crimson Flame. For Zhuemo, if the sun essence concentrated by Art of Crimson Flame was used on the Ling plants, naturally, the more the better. In reality, it also seemed so. Zhuemo had never found a situation where Art of Crimson Flame was overused. Why would he have thought about how to precisely control Art of Crimson Flame? For him, this was a new experience. Thankfully, compared to the other spells, the 5 basic spells of a Ling plant farmer were his most familiar ones. In a short period of time, he grasped the basics of condensing essence of the sun. But when Zhuemo once again tried to buy the raw materials of fasting pills from Su Qing's eyes as they stared at him were slightly weird. Buying a large pile of fasting pill ingredients, Zhuemo secluded himself in the Dan room and started his new experiment. Failure. Still failure. Failure. Zhuemo wasn't panicked because of his failures. Instead, he was very steady and calm. He could feel that he was getting closer to success. This feeling was so strong that quite a few times, he had assumed he would succeed next time. The 9th time, even as the last step was completed, there was no burning smell. Zhuemo's heartbeat quickened. He swallowed his saliva and nervously opened the cauldron. A fasting pill with glimmers of gold quietly laid at the bottom of the cauldron. There wasn't any cheering or jumping. Zhuemo's face was expressionless. He stared dumbly as he muttered, "Gu can finally become rich." Finishing, his eyes turned dark and with a bang, he fell onto the floor in a dead sleep. So tiring. In Wukong Hall, Peiyuan Rant's face was ashen as he looked at the two kneeling below. Luo Li and Hao Min were frightened. Seated above, Shi Fengrong's expression was full of anger again. She had always put great importance on the medicinal fields of Cold Mist Valley, which was why she had given them over for Hao Min to care for. She hadn't thought that Hao Min would so seriously neglect her duty. The expression on Yen Lu and Xen Yan's faces weren't much better. Wukong Sword Sect might only be a small sect, but their rules had always been strict. It wasn't alarming that the others had left, but both had duties, yet they had sneaked out to travel for such a long time, so they were certainly going to get heavily punished. Zhuemo woke up and found that he was still in the Dan room. He hurried, climbed up and looked at the great strength pill he had made before releasing a breath. So he hadn't been dreaming. He was too lazy to go back to the rock room. He decided to sit in the Dan room and meditate to recover Ling energy. When his Ling energy had recovered, he started to make great strength pill again. He didn't know if it was that he had failed too many times before, but the next attempts, he didn't fail once. Feeling slightly tired, Zhuemo stood up. After searching for methods for a few days, his body and heart were really very tired and needed rest. Meditation could recover Ling energy but could not substitute for rest. Pushing open the door to leave the Dan room, the sunlight stabbed Zhuemo's eyes. He raised a hand to cover them. However, the feeling of the sun landing on his body was really good. Successfully making a Dan, Zhuemo's mood was very good. Suddenly, he saw the person walking towards him and blanked. Wasn't that Hao Min Shiji? She and Luo Li Shixiang had returned? Thoughts swirled in Zhuemo's brain and he decided to give a greeting. Hao Min sure. Only when he walked closer did he find it was not good. Hao Min's eyes were red, clearly having cried. Just having been scolded, Hao Min saw Zhuemo and suddenly remembered that Cold Mist Valley had been given to this zombie face to care for. When she suddenly thought of the scolding and sternness of the sect leader and master, her anger rose. It had to be this guy who did it. Otherwise, how would Master have known about Cold Mist Valley? Once the idea emerged, she felt that this zombie face was hateful and resentment rose. An outer sect disciples dared to trick this lady? Her brow raised, without a word, she raised her hand, heading for Zhuemo's face. Zhuemo, who had remained alert, reacted very quickly and grabbed Hao Min's wrist, asking in a deep voice, "Shiji, what are you doing?" The anger in Zhuemo's heart rose up as well. Before, he wouldn't have any choice when he encountered something like this, but now, The two of them were on equal ground. He wouldn't act first, but he didn't have to swallow and bear it. You dare? Hao Min ground her teeth, extremely enraged. Even a trash like you dare to offend me. Before her words landed, her free left hand headed for Zuomo's face, not giving Zuomo the chance to speak. Zuomo's pupils suddenly shrank, his eyes becoming frigid. The right hand that had practiced countless finger movements was extremely fast and nimble. Before Hao Min's hand could reach Zuomo's face, she suddenly felt her eyes blur and a slap landed on her face. Hao Min blanked after the slap. Her face was burning in pain. She looked in disbelief at Zuomo. Su Qing, who had coincidentally just left the yard, saw this scene and almost screamed out in shock. Her reaction was very quick as she used her hands to cover her mouth. Zuomo looked coldly at Hao Min, his voice frigid. Has Shiji woken up? Giving a penetrating look at Hao Min, he released Hao Min's wrist and took a step back. For some reason, when Hao Min met Zuomo's gaze, it was like she was completely frozen, her body cold. She shuddered all over, her face going green and red. Terror, embarrassment, anger, it was all mixed together. She actually forgot to speak. All right. Shiji just returned and might not know the latest news. Zuomo, who had turned around, stopped and said coldly, "This little brother was lucky and was taken into the inner sect, and I am now under master to learn dan making." He turned around his zombie face, showing off 2 rows of eerie white teeth. "Shiji, please take care of me." Su Qing stared with wide eyes as Zuomo left. The blow the scene gave her was too big. Before Zuomo, Hao Ming was the only inner sect disciples in Fragrant Ginger Yard. She had been arrogant and despotic to the extreme. Everyone had feared her. For some reason, when Su Qing saw the 5-fingered handprint on Hao Min's face, she felt unspeakably exhilarated. Glancing at Hao Min, who was still dazedly standing in her original spot, Su Qing decided to quietly leave. If Hao Min Shiji knew that she had seen this incident, then she would be in a miserable situation. Retreating, Su Qing still felt some disbelief. Offer Zuomo formed. Zuo Shixiang, who had been so agreeable, usually actually had a time when he was this scary. Zuomo walked out of Fragrant Ginger Yard, his hand imperceptibly trembling. His heart was full of terror. It wasn't terror due to Hao Min, but terror of himself. Just then, in his anger, there seemed to have been a voice saying to him, "Kill her. Kill her." That impulse was so strong and clear, so strong that what he had given wasn't a slap but sword energy. At what time had he become so ruthless? This discovery made him very nervous. In the stories, all the Yaoma were terrible and evil villains who killed like it was their life. Was the cause practicing embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation, causing his personality had been secretly influenced? Or was it Pu Yao that was behind it? He stopped, closed his eyes and took a deep breath before exhaling. All the negative emotions seemed to have been vented out in this breath. When he opened his eyes, his gaze resumed its clarity, his hands resumed steadiness. It was probably that he was too tired this little while. Zuomo hadn't practiced embryonic breathing spiritual cultivation for a short period of time. This had never happened before. As to Pu Yao, the guy was a perverse one, but he was definitely a cautious perverse. He would never actively stir up trouble. Zuomo found that Pu Yao was still extremely wary of his elders, especially Xen Yen Shishu. Returning to Little West Wind Yard, Zuomo decided to not think at all and rest for a time. He put himself on the guard, reminding himself to be careful and attentive. For a whole day, he did nothing except sleep. He was woken up by the pink paper crane. Yi heard that there were stars appearing during the day? Was it fun? It was still the graceful writing that Zuomo was familiar with. Never heard of it? Zuomo answered confidently. Stars appearing during the day, how was it possible? In any case, he was certain that he had never seen such an abnormal thing. But the news I heard was really like that. Yi has to be careful. Stars appearing during the day is an ill omen. It's possibly Yaoma. Zuomo's heart jumped. Yaoma. Such a familiar smell. Pu Yao had crept up beside Zuomo. He stared at the pink paper in Zuomo's hands and then smiled. So it's that little girl. Zuomo felt that Pu Yao's smile was very cold. You recognize her? He asked carefully. Recognize? Pu Yao's bloody right eye narrowed into a line as he smiled happily. Of course I recognize her. His gaze landed on the paper in Zhuomo's hands and snickered. Yaomo? This little girl is interesting, I like her. Leaving behind a stream of meaningful laughter, Pu Yao disappeared, leaving behind Zhuo with a head full of confusion. Zhuo really didn't have good feelings towards the owner of this paper crane. Anything, once it was forced, the feeling would be very bad. Chatting was also the same. However, it really had been him that brought it upon himself. Zhuo could do nothing about it. His own actions, he had to take responsibility. In the following days, after Zhuo felt he had rested enough, he returned back to his glorious mission of earning Jingshi. In one go, he made 20 great strength pills and gave them all to Li Yingfeng. Li Yingfeng also gave the Jinji jade stick that she had mentioned last time to him and reminded him that his conflict with Hao Min had spread through the entire sect and he should be careful. When Zhuo heard this, he knew it was going to be bad. But he quickly composed himself after some thought. This kind of thing, dodging it wasn't effective. But when he returned to the mouth of West Wing Valley, he saw the ruins of the Jinji and the arrogantly standing Luo Li Shixiang. Zhuo stopped in his steps. Chapter 52 All In. I hadn't thought that even you could become an inner sect disciple. Luo Li's face was expressionless, his voice cold. Zhuo looked inside the valley and he was slightly relieved. Luo Li had only tore down the Jinji at the mouth but didn't go in. He clearly came prepared. Luo Li might be doted upon by all the elders but he didn't dare to act too brashly. If the ling grasses and herbs inside the valley were damaged, the elders in the sect wouldn't let him off. Machinations in the shadows? Zhuo was clear the other didn't dare use them on him. The kind of identity that a ling plant farmer had, it meant that he would receive the sect's protection. What the other could use was an open and public attack. Looking at the mess and the completely ruined Jinji, even though Zhuo knew the other was just venting, but his anger still rose. The other had definitely come because of Hao Min Shiji. Zhuo wasn't scared. He had reason on his side. Even if it got brought up to the sect leader, no one would say that he was wrong. Zhuo controlled the anger, his voice mocking. Shixiang's sword is so sharp. A pity to waste these flowers and grasses. Luo Li looked coldly at Zhuo, his eyes filled with disdain and contempt. Whether my sword is sharp or not, you will know. You dare to touch my woman. Oh. Zhuo brushed it off. He looked at his right hand and said unconcernedly, so what if I touched her? If there hadn't been the previous incident with Hao Min, these two were people that he would have tried to curry favor with. But since it had proceeded to this step, both sides like water and fire, there was no possibility of peace. Zhuo's stubbornness came out. Rather than be bullied, he would rather rebel. Even if it might end terribly for him, he wouldn't let the other off easily. If he didn't have some viciousness, with his origins as an outer sect disciple, he would be greatly bullied in the future. Luo Li's pupils shrunk, the indifferent expression on his face finally changing. 3 months, the assessment of the sect, I'll wait for you. You said wait, so you'll wait? Zhuo smiled coldly and gasped, Shixiang's face is so big. Luo Li's expression twisted. His eyes sprouted fire as he looked at Zhuo. He barely managed to control himself and snorted angrily, let's see if your mouth is still that hard then. Finishing, he flew off. Who does he think he is? Zhuo snorted coldly. He turned to walk inside the valley. Everything in the valley was undisturbed. Luo Li basically didn't come in. Luo Li might be arrogant, but he wasn't dumb. He controlled his behavior. Ruining the Jinji of West Wind Valley but not touching the ling grasses in the valley, the elders of the sect would let it go. They forbid fighting in the sect. Every sect would have this kind of rules. But fighting inside the sect would always happen. There were many reasons, but one of the most important ones was undoubtedly the implicit permission of the elders in the sect. What a sect was afraid of was not having a competitive environment. The occasional skirmish was more beneficial than harmful in the eyes of elders. In most cases, they held a permissive attitude. But Zhou Mo felt that these things didn't have too much to do with him. He didn't believe that Luo Li would dare come into West Wind Valley. His West Wind Valley was one of the important areas of the sect, possibly even more important than Cold Mist Valley. Just like normal, he continued to make Dan, right up until Li Yingfeng Shiji came. What? Zhou Mo cried out, "What kind of rule is that?" Li Yingfeng explained, "It's really like this. Supposedly, because the sect forbid the disciples from fighting, so they made the sect assessment the place for resolving conflicts. He can challenge you at that time and you must take it up. If you don't, you have to give the other 50 contribution points." "But I am a ling plant farmer." A ling plant farmer, do you want me to grab a flying sword and start fighting with him?" Zhou Mo was indignant. "You can ask someone." Li Yingfeng was also helpless. "That doesn't break the rules. Production cultivators like you can use the Dan you make or what you've planted to hire others. But you can only ask the other Shixiang in the sect, not anyone from other sections." "The other Shixiang in the sect? Wei Xing Shixiang hasn't come out, who else can I invite?" Zhou Mo felt that he was going crazy. The only person in the sect that could win over Luo Li was Wei Xing Shixiang. But Wei Xing Shixiang was in the Sword Cave and won't be coming out soon. "The rules are like this," Li Yingfeng suggested. "You could go buy some powerful talismans." Zhou Mo felt that he was going to faint. Buy talismans? He was so poor he only had the dregs. Buying talismans. Only now did Zhou Mo understand what Luo Li had meant in his last word that day. His mood instantly became terrible. Damn it. It was going to be big trouble. Facing Luo Li outside the valley, he wasn't afraid because he had been confident that Luo Li didn't dare to do anything to him. When he knew that the inner sect had this rule, he instantly blanked. Things like sword energy, it was fine to use to frighten people. Facing Luo Li who practiced empty sword, he, someone who didn't even have a sword scripture, wouldn't even know how he died. The elders in the sect, of course, wouldn't let Luo Li really injure him, but humiliation wouldn't be avoided. 50 contribution points, that was a very large amount of wealth. If he sold himself, he wouldn't get 50 contribution points. Thinking about it, Zhou Mo became even more depressed. Li Yingfeng looked in sympathy at Zhou Mo. She wanted to help but had no way. She could only take the great strength pills that Zhou Mo had prepared and left. The news that Luo Li had sent out a challenge to Zhou Mo was instantly spread to everyone in the sect. These days when Hao Min saw Zhou Mo, she instantly became high and mighty. Zhou Mo wanted to slap her again. The gazes of everyone else when they saw Zhou Mo was extremely strange. Of course, there wasn't a lack of others who were laughing at Zhou Mo. No one thought that Zhou Mo was going to have a good outcome. "I heard that your Luo Li Shixiang sent a challenge to you?" Shifeng Rong calmly asked Zhou Mo. Even Master knew. Zhou Mo could only reply, "Yes. And the matter between you and your Haomin Shiji, I won't interfere." Shifeng Rong said coldly, "But the assessment in the sect, I don't care what method you use, but you will not lose. If you lose, The implication in the last sound made Zhou Mo's already withered heart dry up like a flower petal and scatter to the ground. "This disciple is only a ling plant farmer," Zhou Mo couldn't help reminding Master. "So what if you are a ling plant farmer?" Shifeng Rong's voice went up, her eyes resolute. "My disciple cannot lose." "But I don't care what method you use." Shifeng Rong impatiently interrupted Zhou Mo's heart turned and he said, "Master is so confident in this disciple naturally doesn't want to fail. This disciple has nothing to request except to pick a sword scripture from the records room. Since Master wanted him not to lose, then it would be dumb if he didn't ask for a bit of help." He thought of the Li Water sword scripture, in the records room. "It's too late for you to start practicing the sword now." Shifeng Rong furrowed her brow. This disciple only has this one request. Zhou Mo saw that it might be possible and his heart lightened as he hurried responded. "If that's the case, I can agree." She looked at Zhou Mo and her voice was stern as she said, "But if you lose, I won't let you off lightly." "Yes." Zhou Mo resolutely promised. "Take this tile. You can pick a sword scripture from the records room." Shifeng Rong's expression was icy as she stated. 3 months. Right now, Zwarimo was only grateful the sect assessment was 3 months in the future. He still had a hint of life. With the quickest possible speed, he picked Li Water Sword Scripture and ran for the Little West Wind Yard. He was clear what Luo Li was planning on. The whole sect, everyone felt that he didn't have a chance of winning, but Zwarimo didn't want to admit defeat like this. Whenever he thought of Luo Li and Hao Min's faces, the anger in his chest rose. And this would directly decide his future status in the sect. To say of nothing else, Master's warning was in his ears. Wasn't it just a sword scripture? What was simpler than sword scripture? After getting sliced a few thousand times, would he get it? Zwarimo thought hatefully. There was no possibility of winning if he relied on normal methods. His gamble was all on Pu Yao. But gambling on Pu Yao meant countless jingshi. You want help? Alright, as long as you can pay the jingshi. Anything can be discussed. Pu Yao said interestedly, if the price you pay is high enough, oh, I can go sort Luo Li out immediately. Guarantee no one would find out. As expected. As Zwarimo expected, Pu Yao started his extortion. What? It's higher than the previous price? Of course, this is called reacting to the market. The smile on Pu Yao's face was enchanting. You have to consider it well. The price tomorrow would be even higher. Zwarimo went to find Li Yingfeng. Shiji, how much jingshi can you lend me? Zwarimo's eyes were red, his throat rough. Li Yingfeng didn't hesitate. I can lend it all, 3 third grade. Many thanks, Shiji. Zwarimo didn't waste words. There was only gratefulness in his heart. It was only at the crucial time that it could be seen if a person was worthy. Old Black and Guolu also unhesitatingly gave all the jingshi they had to Zwarimo. Even Su Qing secretly gave Zwarimo 50 pieces of second-grade jingshi. The whole sect knew that Zwarimo was borrowing jingshi. Many people were looking at it as a joke. Did he ask you yet? I don't dare to lend to him. Exactly. Just became an inner sect disciple and dare to offend Hao Min Shiji. He really thinks he's someone. Oh, I remember that Xiaomo was a pretty steady person. Why would he do something so dumb? When a little person enjoys success, they become arrogant. Zwarimo sold all of the mature ling herbs and grasses in his ling fields and received 1 piece of third-grade jingshi. Roughly calculating, Zwarimo had about 6 pieces of third-grade jingshi on his hands. This was a huge sum, a sum that Zwarimo had never even thought about. Not long ago, his yearly income was 20 or so second-grade jingshi. The 6 pieces of third-grade jingshi gave off an enticing shine and a strong ling energy vibration. This is everything I gathered, give it all to you. Zwarimo threw the 6 pieces of third-grade jingshi to Pu Yao. Pu Yao grinned as he took the jingshi. He played with one with his right hand, gently throwing it up and then gently catching it. His expression was intoxicated as he said, such a moving sound, jingshi is really the most reliable thing in this world. Teach me this. Zwarimo took out the jade stick for Li Water Sword Scripture, his voice resolute. His expression was slightly tired, the zombie face slightly gray, but the pair of eyes were like 2 balls of jumping flames, hot and vicious. All in. Chapter 53 Great Strength Pill Dong Fu. Master Yen, if there is snow foxtail grass next time, don't forget to notify me. An old person dressed grandly kept on adding. Yen Li's round face was full of smiles. Of course, of course. Master Wang, don't worry. I'll certainly leave it for you. That's good. Master Wang nodded in satisfaction and then said enviously, your sect really has many great talents. You even have a ling plant farmer now. In the future, you'll have more support. Yen Lu was smug inside but didn't show it. He repeatedly shook his hands. Master Wang exaggerates, our sect still needs your guidance. The two exchanged a few more courtesies before Yen Lu saw Master Wang out the door. Ling plant farmers are really ling plant farmers. Returning to the store, Yen Lu sighed in satisfaction. He was extremely grateful that he had coincidentally encountered Zwarimo that day. Otherwise, he might have been snatched away by another sect. If this kept on going, then the sect will have an additional source of wealth. More importantly, the sect's influence in Dongfu will increase dramatically. In the future, Wukong Sword Sect would have an astonishing genius like Wei Xing, a Ling plant farmer like Sua Mo, and someone skilled at business like Li Yingfeng. The sect would pass on very well into their hands. Li Yingfeng took in everything. Taking advantage of Master's good mood, she opened her mouth to help Sua Mo. Yes, Master. Look, our business is much better than before. Sua Mo Shixiang was a large part. Yen Lu was clever and understood what his disciple was saying. He chuckled. You don't have to say things for your Sua Shixiang. I know you two have a good relationship. He said unconcernedly, young people, dampening the spirit, it isn't a bad thing. Your Sua Shixiang looks easy to speak to, but in his bones, he is a very stubborn person. And he had to end up with an extremely competitive master. Ha, it's so funny. Yen Lu thought of something and roared with laughter. Li Yingfeng said furiously, but Shixiang is a Ling plant farmer. The sect assessment only tests the sword. Why not? Little art of cloud and rain? Isn't this to bully people? Huh, disciple, don't be angry. Our sect is a sword sect. If we don't test the sword, what do we test? Don't worry, we're going to be there. Naturally, we wouldn't let him be humiliated too much. But if he isn't as good as others, it's hard to avoid suffering a bit. Yen Li's expression became stern. Us sword cultivators, what we pursue is our hearts like a sword. What is a sword? That is win or lose, that's life or death, that's death if one does not advance. You have to remember, what sword cultivator's walk is going against the heavens. He is a Ling plant farmer, but since he is in a sword sect, he needs to understand this. Li Yingfeng was entranced by the words and became speechless, standing still at her spot. Seeing this, Yen Lu smiled and didn't disturb her, heading inside the hall. Suddenly, someone pushed open the door to enter. The great strength pill I wanted, is there any? The person asked straight away. Li Yingfeng instantly shook and her thoughts returned. She hurriedly responded, yes, yes. The other gave a joyful expression, asking, how many? 20. Great. I'll take all of them. The other instantly said. Li Yingfeng reacted very quickly. She cleverly shook her head, I can only sell 15 to you. The other asked dissatisfied, why can't you sell all of it to me? Li Yingfeng's expression was calm as she lied. Someone reserved 5. All right. The other was helpless. He had only ordered 10 in the beginning, then sell 15 to me. He crisply paid the jingsher, took the great strength pill and rushed away. Li Yingfeng looked at the remaining 5 great strength pills, her mind turning furiously. This person had put so much importance on this great strength pill. This great strength pill definitely had something that wasn't normal. If she could find what was unique, then the way to sell this great strength pill would open. Otherwise, she could only sell to this one person. She decided to send the great strength pill to the medical institute to have an expert examination. Even though it needed a significant payment, she could finally figure out the use of this great strength pill that Shidi had made. Wu Ming held the great strength pill he had just brought, his heart joyful. He didn't know who made the name, but it really wasn't pleasing. Such a good Dan, but such a country bumpkin name. It really ruined the Dan. He was smug inside. It was lucky that he was sensitive to fire-oriented Ling energy. Otherwise last time, he would have brushed right past this Dan. Last time, he had accidentally found that this Dan that was being sold had a faint flavor of fire. He had been born sensitive to the fire element. The fire element in this Dan might be faint, but it was extremely pure, so he had unhesitatingly brought it. After using it, to his joy and surprise, he found that fire energy in the Dan was actually sun essence. Fire, one of the 5 elements. In Sky Moonjia, those that cultivated fire far surpassed the number of those that cultivated the 4 other elements added together. No matter if it was forging, or Dan making, or food refining, it couldn't leave fire. The most common scene was Li fire. It was also the most normal kind of fire. And what was chased after were all kinds of strange fire sources. Producing using high-grade fire sources meant that the process was half done and what was created was even more pure. Originating from the sun, golden crow fire, it was a fire source of 4th grade. Of course, golden crow fire came from the sun, but how to assimilate it, how to nurture it, only a rare few of the biggest sects knew of the method. And it was always passed on secretly. Even more, the fourth-grade golden crow fire was fiery and hard to control. It was easy to harm the body. So the people that could use golden crow fire were very rare. So that was why Wu Ming was so happy when he found that strand of essence of the sun in this great strength pill. What made him even more exhilarated was that this essence of the sun was extremely young, but warm and harmless. Nurturing it inside the body, he actually didn't feel any ill effects. Like a treasure, he grew this strand of sun essence in his body. Even though it was an extremely thin strand and very far from becoming golden crow fire, but if he could buy more great strength pills, and as the sun essence accumulated, there would be hope of the golden crow fire. Even if it would not form golden crow fire, this extremely pure and yang sun essence could increase the grade of other fire sources if it was merged. Golden crow fire wasn't something that could be bought with Jingshi. His mood was very good after buying 15 great strength pills. After absorbing all 15, the sun essence in his body would dramatically increase. It was still very far from forming golden crow energy, but it was a start. Right now, he was hoping that no one else had found the benefit of this great strength pill. However, he knew his thoughts were slightly unrealistic. Other people weren't dumb. Great strength pill should be a new kind of Dan that just came out. As a result, he got a bargain. But he guessed that other people would quickly ascertain its effects. If he wanted to buy it in the future, it wouldn't be at this price. That strand of sun essence, it was worth far more than its present price. But he was already walking in front of everyone else. Adding on that his financial situation was well off, he wasn't afraid. Zhou Mo felt his sea of consciousness was slightly unfamiliar. He hadn't come for a certain period of time and the changes inside were pretty big. The area of the consciousness of much larger than before. The alluring deep red fire was like a furiously growing weed, now a section taller. The star in the void seemed even further away, but it was even more brighter. The temperature of the ice river was even lower, the icicles inside were even finer, the movement of the tides more powerful than before. Well, at least you weren't dumb to the end and picked a sword scripture suited to you. Pu Yao said lazily. Zhou Mo listened extremely attentively. Honestly speaking, your talents at cultivating the sword really aren't anything. If it was your Shixiang, if he had been sliced 10 times by sword essence, he probably would have comprehended it. 20 times, he could reach where you are now. No matter how much of the rationale he understood, sword scriptures had to be practiced. How to manipulate water like fire, he didn't know. 3 months. He only had a time of 3 months. The vision of Hao Min's arrogant attitude and Luo Li's disdainful gaze floated up in his head. Zhou Mo unconsciousness tightened his fist. If he couldn't overcome this step, how could he pursue the answers? Chapter 54 Fire 1 Grade Lingdan contains a small amount of essence of the sun, affects warm, suited for long-term consumption, a certain possibility of forming golden crow fire. Those who consume it can become excited in the short term and can be used for emergencies. When Li Yingfeng received this appraisal, she was shocked. There wasn't much about the other effects, but she was shocked still by a certain possibility of forming golden crow fire. After the appraisal, there was also an order form. The Medicine Institute was hoping to buy 100 pills, price able to be discussed. The Medicine Institute also suggested changing the same to golden crow pill. Clearly, everyone hated the bumpkin name that was great strength pill. Immediately, Li Yingfeng gave the appraisal to her master. Seeing the 3 words golden crow fire, Yen Lu was shocked still. He took the appraisal, throwing down I'm going out, before flying into the sky, heading straight for Wukong Mountain. In Wukong Hall, all 4 elders of the Wukong sword sect were present. Pei Yen Ran looked at the appraisal on his hand and had a serious expression. He said in a deep voice, Golden crow fire, this is a 4th grade fire seed. Xen Yen nodded. Exactly, my green mulberry fire, Shimmy's violet flora fire, they are all 4th grade. I had heard of this golden crow fire before. It comes from the sun, extremely young, extremely strong. It cannot be merged. In the 4th grade, it is a rare find fire source. Pei Yuan Ran smiled at Shifeng Rong. Shimmy is really great. Zuermo had just studied with you and could make such a good thing as this. Shifeng Rong had a cold face. This has nothing to do with me. Pei Yuan Ran smiled, not minding. He lowered his head to think. The other people were also silent. Golden Crow Fire, 4th grade fire source. This caused this little Dan's price to fly into the sky. Xixiang. Yen Le couldn't resist stating, if it can form Golden Crow Fire, then its use for the sect would be gigantic. Doesn't Su Yi still lack a good fire seed? And Zuemo himself, if he's learning Dan making, how can he not have a fire seed? What he was implying was that he wasn't very willing to sell it. Pei Yuan Ran raised his head, responding, I understand what you mean. That child, Su Yi, I like him as well. And the forging branch of this sect would likely be passed on through him. He really does need Golden Crow Fire. But we still have to sell some. Right now, the outside probably has heard the news about this Dan. If we don't sell any, it would enrage the public. That would only harm the sect without any benefit. Then Xixiang means, Yen Lu was hesitant. Just sell a small portion, we'll use the majority ourselves. Pei Yuan Ran gave a slight smile. We'll give the market price to Zuemo, not 1 piece less. Market price? Yes. Paper cannot hide fire. There are only just that many people in our Wukong sword sect that can make Dan. There's no need to cause Zuemo to hate us in secret because of a few pieces of Jingshi. Zuemo's past is unclear. There may be trouble in the future. Shifeng Rong, who had kept her cold face, suddenly opened. Wukong Hall became silent. Zuemo's identity and origins was a question that everyone had been having a headache about. Before, Zuemo had only been an outer sect disciple. His origin hadn't been a big problem. But right now, he wasn't just an inner sect disciple. Based on the direction, he would certainly become one of the core members of the next generation of Wukong sword sect. His identity and origins became a problem that Pei Yuan Ran and the others had to face. His origins might not be a problem, Yen Lu said unconfidently. Pei Yuan Ran waved his hand. Since we don't know anything, then don't think too much about it. Regardless, just the fact that he is a Ling plant farmer, that's enough that we cannot give him up. Even more, there's now this Ling Dan that could make Golden Crow Fire. Hearing this, everyone didn't speak anymore. They all knew that sect leader Xixiang was right. If they suddenly expelled Zuemo right now out of the sect, it would be what countless people wanted. Exen Yen suddenly asked, can Shimmy make this kind of Dan? I don't know, Art of Crimson Flame. Shifeng Rong said coolly, this Dan needs to use Art of Crimson Flame. Manipulate water like fire. It was easy to say, but for a Ling plant farmer, it was very difficult, especially when it was in a sword scripture. There were, in total, 7 moves in Li water sword scripture. Manipulate water like fire was the core, but it was too far right now for Zuemo. What he needed to do was familiarize himself with the sword moves. Each move would always have a few dozens of transformations. And each transformation needed to be controlled by Ling energy. Even more, the entire process had to be completed in a thought. Based on the complexity of Ling energy manipulation, these sword moves weren't as complex as Little Art of Cloud and Rain, but they needed to be finished in a very short amount of time, so the difficulty actually increased. When making the move, the attention needed to be focused. That was even truer during battle. The other usually wouldn't give you the chance to think. You needed to instinctively finish the complete move. This was also why sword cultivators liked pure things. The purer something was, the less the disturbance it had. Zuemo finally could use that ice crystal sword. It was certainly a painful thing to look at a good item yet be unable to use it. The ice crystal sword turned into a flashing white light as it flew around Zuemo, coldness seeping out. Gu will slice it 10,000 times. If it fails, then a few dozen more. Don't believe it won't work. If it doesn't, then slice 1,000,000 times. Slice until it works. Having decided, Zuemo wasn't panicked anymore and raised up his sword. I slice. Little West Wind Yard. The sword energy flew, coldness spread. A storefront on the west street of Dongfu. Many people had already gathered. These people gathered together and chattered and argued. Why hasn't it opened yet? I've already waited an entire night. Someone grouched. What's a night? I've been guarding for 2 days and nights. A person on the side followed up. Is this store going to open? Are they playing with us? What can we do? It's their Dan. If they want to sell, they sell. If they don't, you don't have a choice. That's true. Do you really think that Golden Crow pill can really form Golden Crow fire? Someone couldn't resist asking. 4th grade Golden Crow fire. Does anyone in Dongfu have it? Haven't heard that anyone had it. But it was an appraisal from the Medicine Institute, so it shouldn't be far off. Nothing else, essence of the sun, it would be beneficial if it's added to a fire source. The person who spoke was brawny and tall with a square face and large ears. He sighed, the kind of thing that is fire seed, especially good fire source, is it something people like us can buy? Bro, what do you do? Me. The square-faced man said, I make food. At this time, an old man suddenly greeted him. Hey, Master Xiao, you came too. The crowd suddenly stirred. The person who had been speaking with the square-faced man instantly had a very interesting expression. No one would have thought that this large and brawny man was actually the best Ling food chef in Dongfu. The food pavilion of Master Xiao, it was the most famous Ling food restaurant in Dongfu. He was especially skilled at making marvelous combinations of all kinds of Ling food. The Ling food he made, it didn't only increase cultivation but the flavor was incomparable. Just Ling grains, he could make over 36 dishes. The square-faced man raised his hands. Shopkeeper Wang, are you also here for the Golden Crow pill? The crowd stirred again. Some people had already guessed the old man's origins. Master Xiao's food pavilion, Wang So Wine. The food pavilion sold all kinds of Ling food, and old man Wang was skilled at fermenting all kinds of Ling wine. Exactly. The person was a thin old man, his spine slightly bent but his beady eyes were extremely bright. His expression was slightly helpless. I'm here for my precious granddaughter. Master Xiao chucked. What's the little girl learning? Forging. Old man Wang was clearly unsatisfied with his granddaughter choosing to learn forging. He couldn't help complaining. My son learnt Dan making, my granddaughter learns forging. My handicraft, it seems I'm taking it into the ground. Don't panic, don't panic. If you ask for disciples, there would be countless people trying to get in. Master Xiao hurriedly comforted. Oh, evidently having thought of something, old man Wang sighed. He looked at the surroundings. Seeing that more and more people were coming, his brow furrowed. This Wukong sword sect looks like it's going to rise. And Master Xiao agreed. But they do have the ability. Yes. At this time, the tightly closed store door suddenly opened. Chapter 55. Going to get rich? Li Yingfeng was slightly drowsy as she opened the store door. After Master had rushed back to Wukong Mountain a few days ago, he still hadn't returned. These 2 days, because Master wasn't here, she had kept the store closed. In any case, the recent inventory had pretty much all been sold. The next batch of Ling Dan from 4th Shirgu still hadn't left the cauldron and there wasn't much else to sell in the store. Wukong sword sect was only a small sect and didn't have much produce. In Dongfu they only had this small store. Most of what they sold were the Ling Dan that 4th Shirgu made and the talismans that 2nd Shirshu forged. If nothing was happening, she would sleep. After entering Zhuji, there wasn't much need for sleep. However, for women sleep wasn't just a requirement, it was a form of relaxation. On this point, Li Yingfeng wasn't an exception. She frequently slept until her eyes rolled and became muddle-headed. It was completely different from her usual cleverness and generosity. Muddle-headed, Li Yingfeng seemed to see that there were many people outside the door. She suddenly became alert, her drowsiness completely vanished. Looking at the dense field of people, her entire body became numb. So many people, what had happened? It's open. Finally open. Hey boss, I want to buy. Pushing open the store door was like the spark that lit the fire. The originally quiet situation suddenly became noisy and messy. Looking at the sea of heads outside, Li Yingfeng was like a statue, pinned to the door entrance. In the West Wind Valley, Zhuo Emo felt that his entire body was numb, not one place wasn't sore. Barely controlling the Ling energy in his body, the ice crystal sword was wobbling in mid-air. His eyes glared furiously as he tried to control the last remaining bit of Ling energy in his body. Go! The voice was rough and dissonant. The wobbling ice crystal sword turned to a flash of white light, leaving behind a faint cold mist in the air. The white light hit the wooden target 10 feet away. There was a figure drawn on the target. It was the person who Zhuo Emo cursed countless times every day, Luo Li. The wooden target instantly shattered. Each fragment was coated with a thin layer of ice. Fighting with the kill you. Opening his eyes, Zhuo Emo couldn't resist groaning. So painful. As he was struggling up, when he saw where he was, he finally remembered that he had fainted when practicing Li Water Sword scripture, as his Ling energy ran out. First seeing that he was covered in mud. Then thinking about how in his dream he had demolished the wooden target that had Luo Li drawn on it, he couldn't help laughing. That was really absurd. 1006. That was the number of attacks he remembered before fainting. The Ling energy in his body was at a dangerously low level. Before fainting, he had used up the Ling energy too much. He decided to go to the rock room to recover his Ling energy. The soreness over his body meant that each step was extremely painful. Like a turtle, he moved slowly towards the opening, his mouth giving groans along the way. Shitty, shitty. Zhuo Emo suddenly heard someone yelling from outside the valley. It was somewhat familiar. He stopped walking. He was secretly grateful that he hadn't entered the stone room. He saw Su Yi Shixiang fly in. When he saw Zhuo Mo's sorry state, he first blanked and then smiled. How did Shitty get like this? Zhuo Emo grimaced. I wasn't careful when practicing the sword and tripped. Shitty really is hard-working. Su Yi praised and then sighed. The matter between Shitty and Luo Li Shixiang, I can't really do anything. I heard that Shitty was lacking in Jingshi. I still have some and can relieve Shitty's need. Finishing, he took out 2 pieces of 3rd-grade Jingshi. Zhuo Emo blanked. He had a good impression of Su Yi but didn't have a deep relationship. He had never thought that Su Yi Shixiang would stand on his side on this matter. The other coming of his own initiative to shove Jingshi at him, it was too strange. And Zhuo Emo was even more surprised by Su Yi Shixiang's next move. He saw Su Yi Shixiang take out a silver bracelet and hand it to Zhuo Emo. This is the Star Silver Vambrace. It is a defensive talisman I forged. 2nd grade, able to block 3 attacks from a Ningmai cultivator. Finishing his explanation, he shoved it into Zhuo Mo's chest. Zhuo Emo was confused, and he completely did not understand the situation. Right, does Shitty still have any more of the Great Strength Pill? Su Yi asked warmly. Great Strength Pill? He didn't know how Su Yi Shixiang knew about the Great Strength Pill. Looking at the 2 pieces of 3rd-grade Jingshi and the shining vambrace on his hands, Zhuo Emo was almost knocked unconscious by the meat pie from the sky. He replied instinctively, nothing left. Then I want to order 100 from Shitty, each 150 pieces of 2nd-grade Jingshi. How about it? Su Yi stared at Zhuo Emo as he asked. 52nd-grade Jingshi each 100. Was he dreaming? He still hasn't woken up? He looked dumbly at a place not far away. There wasn't the wooden target that Luo Li was drawn on. Wasn't dreaming. 100 pills. Each 150 pieces of 2nd-grade Jingshi, he muttered to himself. Right, what does Shitty think? Su Yi was slightly nervous. Had the world gone crazy? Zhuo Emo looked at Su Yi Shixiang staring at him and thought dumbly. Does Shitty have some problems? Su Yi saw that Zhuo Emo hadn't reacted for a long time and couldn't resist asking. No problem. Zhuo Mo's voice was slightly weak. For some reason, he didn't feel any joy. It might be that it felt too unrealistic. Amazing! I just knew that Shitty would definitely help, Su Yi grinned. He took out 5 pieces of 3rd-grade Jingshi and shoved it onto Zhuo Mo's hand. These 5 pieces of 3rd-grade Jingshi can be the down payment. Shitty's body is the first priority, don't tire yourself. Shitty doesn't have to send all 100 pills at the same time. Oh, after the sect assessment, Don't rush. Zuoremo dumbly agreed. Seeing Su Yi Shixiang contentedly leave, he still held a dumb expression. He hadn't managed to absorb what just happened. Who could tell him what was going on? Maybe it was really a dream, Zuoremo thought inside. Maybe in the next instant, he would wake up, and the things on his hands would disappear in a blink. Is Shirji here? Yen Lushirshu's voice sounded from outside the valley. Before Zuoremo could reply, Yen Lushirbo flew in. When Yen Lu saw Zuomo's state, he first stilled and then smiled. Oh, Shitzi really is hardworking. It really seemed that there was great hope for this year's sect assessment. Shirbo. Zuoremo didn't dare offend him. Even if his entire body was sore, he still bowed. Yen Lushirbo saw the things in Zuomo's arms and then thought of Su Yi who he encountered outside the valley. He couldn't help but curse inside. Su Yi might be collected and calm usually, but his feet were really quick. Just now, I encountered your Su Yi Shixiang. He should have already ordered great strength pill from you. Yen Lu said smilingly. Huh, how does Shirbo know? In the elders, Zuoremo felt the most harmonious was Yen Lu Shirbo. Haha, how many did he order? Yen Lu asked in response. 100 pills. As expected, the same as second Shixiang. A single move was this vicious. Yen Lu swore inside, but the smile on his face became even more harmonious. Shirbo has come this time for great strength pill as well. Zuoremo, whose thoughts had just returned, suddenly stilled. Does Shirji's great strength pill contain sun essence? Yen Lu stared at Zuoremo as he asked. Yes. Zuoremo woodenly nodded. Yen Lu clapped his hands and praised, as expected. Zuoremo was frightened. With a head full of confusion, Zuoremo finally couldn't bear it and asked, even now, this disciple doesn't understand. Shirbo, what is going on? Shirji, don't rush, I will tell you all. Only now did Yen Lu tell the result of the appraisal of great strength pill to Zuoremo fire source. Zuoremo had seen it before on the records. No matter if it was forging or dan making, as long as it was using the fire method, a fire source was something necessary. The more rare and precious high quality the fire source was, the greater its aid in the process. Especially for those experts in dan and forging, fire source was especially important. Zuoremo finally understood. What golden crow fire exactly was, Zuoremo wasn't clear, but if it really was a fine one among the 4th grade fire source like Yen Lushirbo said, he instantly understood the value of the dan he made. Golden crow fire was the object of the dreams of the dan and forging cultivators.